The wind that slipped through the ancient stone streets carried the sweet, earthy scent of early summer, and with it, a quiet, unspoken holding of breath. If you were to stand in the center of the medieval city of Caen in those delicate days before the storm broke, you would see a place that seemed entirely lost in time. Above the slate roofs and the winding alleys, the great spires of the ancient abbeys reached upward into a vast, pale sky. These towering monuments, the Abbey of Men and the Abbey of Women, had stood as silent guardians over the valley for nearly a millennium. Their pale limestone walls, carved by hands long forgotten, absorbed the soft golden light of the morning sun, just as they had done for generations. Life here moved at the gentle, rhythmic pace of a heartbeat. It was a tapestry woven with the familiar threads of cobblestone routines. Before the world awoke fully, the morning mist would cling to the slow-moving waters of the River Orne, drifting through the willow branches and curling around the stone bridges. In this hazy, twilight hour, the city belonged to the quiet workers. You could hear the soft scrape of wooden shutters being pushed open, one by one, greeting the dawn. Down in the narrow streets, the air would begin to fill with the warm, comforting aroma of baking bread, rising from the small boulangeries that had somehow managed to keep their ovens lit. Inside one such bakery, a mother named Elodie stood in the dim light, her hands dusted in precious, rationed flour. She worked the dough with a practiced, rhythmic motion. Knead, fold, press. It was a simple, grounding act. With every push of her palms, she pushed away the creeping anxieties of the world outside. She did not think of armies or empires in those early hours. She thought only of the soft rise of the yeast, the warmth of the oven, and the small, sleepy smiles of her children waiting upstairs for their meager breakfast. Yet, beneath this comforting veneer of ordinary life, a quiet tension hummed, as delicate and fragile as a spun-glass thread. The occupation had woven a metallic scent into the fresh summer air. Gray uniforms moved through the ancient market squares, a constant, silent reminder of a world out of balance. But behind the closed doors and drawn curtains, the people of Caen nurtured a quiet, stubborn resilience. It was not a loud or roaring defiance, but the everyday heroism of simply carrying on. It was found in the way neighbors shared a handful of dried beans or a single, wilted cabbage over the back garden fence, their voices dropped to a gentle whisper. It was in the way a grandmother, her eyes clouded with age but bright with memory, would sit by the hearth and mend a threadbare sweater for the third time, her needle flashing like a tiny silver fish in the candlelight. She stitched her love into every worn seam, wrapping her family in whatever warmth she could provide. In the walled gardens tucked away behind heavy wooden gates, an old man named Henri spent his afternoons tending to his roses. He had seen the dark clouds of war before, in his own youth, and his hands bore the scars of a harder time. But here, among the soft, velvet petals of crimson and cream, he found a profound peace. He would kneel in the damp soil, carefully pruning the wild thorns, his breathing slow and steady. When his young grandson came running to him, frightened by the sudden, distant rumble of an airplane engine high above the clouds, Henri would simply smile, pull the boy close, and point out a robin resting on a low branch. He taught the boy the names of the flowers, the songs of the birds, and the way the shadows lengthened in the afternoon sun. It was a quiet rebellion of beauty against the encroaching dark. He was determined to build a fortress of gentle memories for the child, a sanctuary of innocence that no army could touch. And what of the young men in those gray uniforms, stationed in the shadows of the ancient spires? They, too, were caught in the strange, suspended animation of the waiting city. Many of them were barely more than boys, wearing uniforms that seemed to hang a little too loosely on their shoulders. They patrolled the cobblestones with a lingering uncertainty in their eyes, far from the familiar forests and mountains of their childhood homes. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the city fell completely still, a young soldier named Johannes would sit on his narrow cot in a requisitioned schoolhouse, a small notepad resting on his knee. The pale moonlight filtered through the blackout curtains, casting long, dusty beams across the wooden floorboards. He chewed on the end of his pencil, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He did not write of grand strategies or the looming shadow across the sea. Instead, he wrote to his mother in a small Bavarian village. He wrote about the strange, beautiful architecture of the French churches. He asked if the stray dog that slept on their porch had returned, and if the cherry blossoms in their backyard had bloomed yet. He poured his homesickness into the delicate loops and curves of his handwriting, folding the paper carefully, as if it held his very heart. He was just a boy, longing for the smell of his mother's cooking and the comforting embrace of his own bed. This was the shared, unspoken reality of Caen. Two worlds, existing side by side in the breathless heat of early June, both looking up at the same vast sky, both waiting for a tomorrow they could not predict. As the afternoon stretched into evenings, the great bronze bells of the abbeys would begin to toll. Their deep, resonant voices rolled over the rooftops, vibrating through the chest, a sound that had anchored the city for hundreds of years. The bells had rung through plagues and harvests, through the crowning of kings and the passing of generations. Now, they rang for a city holding its breath. The sound seemed to slow time itself, wrapping the streets in a heavy, golden melancholy. With the setting sun came the ritual of the shadows. The pale stone of the buildings turned to deep violet, then to indigo, and finally surrendered to the charcoal gray of night. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn tightly across every window in the city, like blankets pulled up to the chin to ward off the cold. The streets emptied. The iron gates were locked. The city of Caen closed its eyes. Inside the darkened homes, families gathered around small, flickering candles in the center of their kitchen tables. These small islands of light felt sacred, intimate. Here, voices were lowered to the softest murmurs. Parents stroked the hair of their sleeping children, watching the gentle rise and fall of their small chests in the dim light. In the quiet dark, private fears bubbled to the surface. Will we have enough food for the week? Will the storm pass us by? A mother might lean her head against her husband's shoulder, seeking the simple, solid comfort of his presence. No words were needed. The grip of a hand, the warmth of an embrace, these were the lifelines they clung to in the ocean of uncertainty. Deep in the damp, cool cellars, hidden radios were turned on with a quiet click. The dials were tuned with infinite care, searching through the static for a whisper of truth from the outside world. The soft crackle of the broadcast was mesmerizing, a rhythmic hiss and hum that felt like the breathing of a distant giant. Cryptic messages floated through the airwaves, poetic phrases about blooming flowers and falling autumn leaves that carried the weight of history. The listeners sat perfectly still, their faces illuminated by the faint orange glow of the radio tubes, drinking in every word. They did not know the hour or the day, but they felt the shift in the wind. They knew the waiting was coming to an end. Outside, the city slept under a blanket of stars. The River Orne continued its slow, murmuring journey toward the sea, a silver ribbon winding through the dark valley. The ancient gargoyles perched high upon the ledges of St. Etienne stared out over the silent rooftops, their stone eyes fixed on the northern horizon. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking calm. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a sweet perfume that masked the edge of fear. The cobblestones, still warm from the afternoon sun, radiated a gentle heat into the cool night air. If you listened closely, you could hear the subtle, organic sounds of an old city at rest. The settling of ancient timber, the soft rustle of ivy clinging to a limestone wall, the distant, rhythmic footsteps of a solitary guard walking his post. In this suspended moment, enemies and friends alike shared the exact same vulnerability. The young German soldier clutching his letter from home, the French mother watching over her sleeping child, the old gardener dreaming of his roses. They were all just human beings, wrapped in the fragile, fleeting quiet of a summer night, breathing in the darkness, wishing for peace. The shadows over the spires grew long and deep, merging into the vastness of the night sky. The city of Caen lay perfectly still, suspended in a delicate dream, resting peacefully in the final moments of a world that was about to change forever. The night was soft. The stars were bright. And in the hushed and tender dark, the quiet heartbeat of humanity drummed on, steady and slow, waiting for the dawn. A deep, low rumble, felt more in the wooden floorboards than heard in the cool air, stirred the sleeping city long before the sun had a chance to rise. It was a sensation before it was a sound. A delicate, continuous vibration that traveled through the deep limestone foundations of the earth, up through the ancient cobblestones, and into the walls of the homes where the people of Caen lay sleeping. On the small wooden washstands beside their beds, the water resting in porcelain basins began to shiver, forming tiny, intricate ripples that danced in the dark. Dust motes, suspended in the quiet air, trembled just a little. It was not the sharp crack of thunder from a passing summer storm. This was something different. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding, steady and relentless, rolling in from the northern coast like the heartbeat of a giant waking from a long, deep slumber. In a narrow house near the edge of the city, a woman named Marguerite opened her eyes to the dim, gray light of early dawn. She did not sit up right away. She lay perfectly still beneath the heavy cotton quilt, her breath catching in her throat, listening to the distance. Beside her, she felt the subtle shift of the mattress as her husband, Thomas, awoke. He did not ask her what the sound was. He simply reached out across the cool sheets and found her hand. His fingers curled around hers, a warm, solid anchor in a sudden sea of uncertainty. They lay there together, listening to the faraway echoes of June the 6th, speaking volumes to one another without ever whispering a single word. The air in the room felt different today. It felt thick, charged with an invisible electricity. The quiet routine of the morning, usually so comforting and automatic, suddenly carried the profound weight of a final ritual. Marguerite slowly slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. She wrapped a worn woolen shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill and made her way softly down the narrow stairs to the kitchen. Every movement she made was deliberate, careful, as if moving too quickly might shatter the fragile peace of the house. She struck a single match, the sudden flare of yellow light pushing back the shadows. She lit the small gas stove, watching the blue ring of fire flicker to life. She reached for the tin of roasted chicory, their meager substitute for coffee, and measured it out with infinite care. When she poured the boiling water, the dark, earthy aroma rose into the air, a familiar comfort on a morning that felt entirely unfamiliar. Thomas came down the stairs a few moments later, his suspenders hanging loosely at his sides. He sat at the worn oak table, resting his chin in his hands, his eyes fixed on the window pane. The glass was vibrating gently against its frame. Marguerite placed a warm porcelain cup in front of him. The gentle clink of the spoon against the rim seemed remarkably loud in the quiet kitchen. They sat in the dim light, nursing their warm drinks, letting the heat seep into their palms. They traded quiet glances over the rims of their cups. In Thomas's eyes, Marguerite saw the reflection of her own private anxieties. Would the fighting reach their doorstep? How long would the heavy thunder last? But beneath the fear, there was also a tiny, fiercely guarded spark of hope. A hope they had not dared to speak aloud for years, now echoing in the distance. Upstairs, the children were still asleep. Marguerite climbed the steps once more, pausing at the threshold of their small bedroom. The early morning light was just beginning to filter through the cracks in the blackout curtains, casting a soft, pale blue glow over the room. Her youngest son lay tangled in his blankets, his cheek pressed softly against his pillow, his breathing slow and even. Marguerite walked over and gently brushed a stray curl of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm. He mumbled softly in his sleep, completely unaware of the massive tide of history that was crashing onto the shores just a few miles away. Marguerite felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of protective love. She tucked the blanket securely under his chin. This was her everyday heroism, absorbing the terror of the waking world so that her child might dream in peace for just 1 hour longer. As the sun began to crest the horizon, painting the sky in delicate shades of lavender and pale gold, the city of Caen slowly stepped out of doors. Wooden doors unlatched with soft clicks. People stepped onto their front stoops, pulling their coats tightly around themselves. They stood on the sidewalks, their faces turned toward the north. The morning wind carried the familiar, salty scent of the sea, but today it carried something else, too. A faint, metallic tang. The smell of turned earth and gray smoke, carried on the breeze from the beaches. Neighbors met each other's eyes across the narrow streets. An old baker, his apron already dusted with flour, tipped his hat to the woman sweeping her steps. She gave him a small, solemn nod in return. There was no panic in the streets. There was no shouting. Instead, there was a profound, suspended awe. It was the feeling of holding one's breath just before plunging into deep water. The waiting was over. The horizon was alight. On the other side of the city, the young soldiers of the occupying garrison were also awake. The sleepy, suspended animation of their barracks had vanished, replaced by a sudden, icy apprehension. Young boys, many who had never seen the true face of combat, sat on the edges of their cots, lacing their heavy black boots. Their fingers were clumsy, trembling slightly as they pulled the stiff leather tight. Johannes, the young soldier who had spent the previous evening writing to his mother, stood by a small window looking out over the awakening city. He reached into the inner pocket of his gray tunic, his fingertips brushing against the folded paper of his unsent letter. It rested right over his heart, a fragile paper shield against the immense, terrifying unknown. He looked at the French citizens standing on their balconies. He looked at the beautiful, ancient spires of the abbeys catching the first rays of the morning sun. In this soft, pastel dawn, the differences between them seemed suddenly very small. They were all just fragile human beings, caught in the exact same tremor of the earth, humbled by the vastness of the storm that was rolling toward them. Johannes closed his eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and sent a silent, desperate prayer into the universe, hoping it would somehow find its way over the mountains and back to his home. Deep in the attics and cellars of the city, small groups of people huddled closely around their hidden radios. The dials were turned with eager, trembling fingers. The static was thick and hissing, but the voices breaking through the noise were different this morning. They were no longer speaking in cryptic poetry or vague metaphors. They carried the breathless, crackling reality of arrival. As the truth of the distant thunder settled into their hearts, tears began to pool in the corners of tired eyes. It was a complex, heartbreaking emotion. It was the overwhelming joy of a promise finally kept, tangled beautifully and terribly with the deep dread of what it would cost. A grandmother sitting near the radio reached out and took the hand of the young woman beside her. Their fingers intertwined tightly. The warmth of a neighbor's palm, the gentle squeeze of shared understanding, these were the small comforts that tethered them to the ground while the world spun out of control. They wept quietly in the dark, letting the tears fall freely, a quiet release of years of held breath. In the bedrooms and sitting rooms across the city, families began the tender, deliberate work of preparation. No one knew if they would have to leave their homes, but the distant booming suggested it was wise to be ready. It was in these quiet moments that the true resilience of the human spirit revealed itself. A father stood before an open leather satchel on his bed. He moved with a slow, thoughtful grace. He did not pack silver or valuables. Instead, he carefully folded a heavy woolen sweater, pressing his hands against the soft fabric. He tucked a small tin of hoarded, precious biscuits into the corner. Then, he walked to the mantelpiece and took down a small, silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of his wife and children on a summer picnic, sitting in a field of tall grass, their faces bright with uncomplicated laughter. He wiped a speck of dust from the glass with his thumb. He wrapped the photograph gently in a clean linen handkerchief and placed it securely in the center of the bag. These were the things that mattered. These were the anchors of identity, the portable pieces of their souls that they could carry against their chests, preserving the memory of who they were, no matter where the tide of the day might wash them. Down the hall, a mother was gently pinning a small piece of paper to the inside lining of her daughter's wool coat. On it, she had written the child's name, her own name, and the address of an aunt in a faraway village. Her hand shook slightly as she fastened the safety pin, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She smoothed the collar of the coat, patting it flat, a silent prayer woven into the fabric. She was preparing for the unthinkable with quiet, devastating dignity. Outside, the sun had fully risen. The golden light of morning poured over the slate roofs and the winding cobblestone alleys. Nature, it seemed, was entirely indifferent to the affairs of men. The birds, perhaps confused by the continuous thunder echoing from the north, decided to sing their morning songs anyway. Their sweet, trilling melodies wove through the heavy, vibrating air, a surreal and beautiful juxtaposition. The willow trees along the river Orne swayed gently in the breeze, their green branches trailing in the slow-moving water. The city of Caen stood beautiful and breathless, bathed in the gentle warmth of the early summer sun. The citizens of this ancient place stood at the thresholds of their doors, listening to the footsteps of history marching ever closer. They breathed in the cool June air. They found courage in the quiet spaces between the distant thuds. They looked at the familiar faces of their neighbors, they held their loved ones a little tighter, and they stepped softly, bravely, into the dawn. The twilight of their old world did not arrive with the setting sun, but with a strange, heavy shadow that swept across the summer sky. For hours, the people of Caen had listened to the distant, rhythmic thudding from the coast, a faraway tempest that felt more like a dream than a reality. But then, the hum shifted. It was no longer a vibration carried through the earth. It became a sound that seemed to pour down from the heavens themselves. A low, droning chorus filled the air, thick and resonant, like the beating of countless wings. When the citizens looked up, shielding their eyes from the bright afternoon glare, they saw them. High above the delicate spires of the abbeys, silver shapes drifted through the clouds, moving with a slow, hypnotic grace that entirely belied their terrible purpose. At first, there was only a profound, suspended disbelief. The ancient stone walls of the city had stood for centuries. They had weathered countless seasons, sheltering generations of families within their thick, reassuring embrace. The illusion of safety was so deeply woven into the cobblestones and the slate roofs that it was almost impossible to comprehend that it could be undone. But as the first heavy raindrops of a new and devastating storm began to fall, that illusion fractured, as quietly and irrevocably as a piece of fine porcelain slipping from a table. There was no sudden, deafening crescendo, but rather a series of deep, breath-stealing sighs from the earth. When the ground shuddered, it was as if the city itself was absorbing a profound sorrow. Inside the homes, the familiar, comforting world began to unspool. In a quiet parlor near the center of town, an old grandfather clock that had ticked faithfully through decades of peace and war suddenly stopped its pendulum. A thin layer of pale, centuries-old dust drifted down from the wooden rafters, coating the dining room tables and the polished floors in a soft, ghostly frost. In a small apartment overlooking a narrow square, a young father named Luke knelt on the trembling floorboards before his little girl. The walls around them groaned, a deep and mournful sound, but Luke did not look up. He focused entirely on the small, worn laces of his daughter's leather shoes. His hands were shaking slightly, but he moved with deliberate, practiced tenderness, tying a perfect double knot. He smoothed her wool socks. He buttoned her light coat all the way to her chin, though the June air outside was warm. In the face of a world fracturing beyond his control, this small, parental act of care was his anchor. It was the only thing that made sense. He looked into her wide, questioning eyes and offered a soft, reassuring smile, though his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "We're just going for a walk," he whispered, his voice steady and calm, betraying none of the fear that gripped him. He scooped her up into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, shielding her face from the plaster dust that was beginning to swirl through the hallway. All across the city, inside hundreds of dimly lit rooms, similar quiet moments of reckoning were unfolding. The realization that they could not stay washed over the families of Caen not with panic, but with a heavy, melancholic clarity. The time for waiting had passed. It was time to leave the only sanctuary they had ever known. But what do you take when you have only moments to gather your life? The choices made in those fleeting minutes were deeply intimate, a silent poetry of the human heart. They did not reach for heavy silver or cumbersome furniture. They reached for the fragile tethers of their identity. A woman named Beatrice stood in her bedroom, the glass of her windowpane spider-webbed with cracks. She bypassed her jewelry box entirely and instead opened a small, cedar chest at the foot of her bed. From it, she lifted a bundle of letters bound in a faded blue ribbon, the letters her husband had written to her before they were married. She slipped them into the deep pocket of her coat, pressing her hand over them. As long as she had his words, she had her home. Down the street, an elderly man named Arthur hesitated at his doorway. He turned back, his eyes sweeping over the quiet sitting room. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a small, hand-carved wooden bird his father had whittled for him when he was a boy. It was smooth from years of being held, carrying the warmth of his history. He placed it carefully into his satchel, nestled safely between a loaf of bread and a woolen blanket. As the citizens finally pushed open their heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the streets, they were met with a sight that stole the breath from their lungs. The sky, which only hours before had been a tapestry of soft blues and gentle clouds, was now glowing with a terrifying, ethereal orange. It was a sunset painted in the middle of the afternoon. Plumes of dark, velvet smoke drifted lazily upward, catching the amber light and glowing like the embers of a massive, dying hearth. Ash began to fall from the sky. It drifted down like warm, gray snow, settling softly onto the shoulders of coats, dusting the brims of hats, and gathering in the quiet corners of the cobblestone streets. The air smelled of burnt timber, of ancient dust turned over, and of the sweet, metallic tang of the displaced earth. In this surreal, amber twilight, the people of Caen began to move. It was a slow, shuffling exodus. There was no running, no shouting. Just the steady, crunching sound of footsteps over broken glass and fallen slate. Neighbors who had lived beside each other for years, who had shared morning greetings and complaints about the weather, now walked shoulder to shoulder in silent solidarity. They looked at one another, their faces illuminated by the strange, fiery glow from above. In their eyes, reflected in the orange light, was a shared, profound disbelief. But there was also a remarkable, quiet grace. Even as their city fractured around them, the gentle fabric of their humanity held strong. A young woman, struggling to carry a heavy, overstuffed suitcase, suddenly found the weight lifting. She turned to see an older gentleman, a stranger whose own face was pale with exhaustion, holding the other handle. He did not say a word, only offered a small, polite nod, and together they continued walking. Further down the road, a baker who had lost the front window of his shop stood on the sidewalk. He held a basket of rolls that had survived the trembling earth. As the procession of families walked past, he gently pressed the warm bread into the hands of passing children, offering a soft smile, a fleeting moment of normalcy and nourishment in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. The warmth of the burning buildings radiated into the streets, wrapping the evacuees in a strange, suffocating heat. They clutched their children, their bundled coats, and their small, precious keepsakes tightly against their bodies. Every step carried them further from the hearths they loved, away from the gardens they had tended, away from the bedrooms where their children had learned to dream. As they reached the outer edges of the city, where the roads turned from cobblestone to dirt, many stopped and turned back for one last look. The great spires of the abbeys still stood, silhouetted darkly against the churning, ember-lit sky. They looked like ancient, steadfast guardians refusing to bow to the storm. The sight was heartbreakingly beautiful. It was a picture of their beloved home, wounded but enduring, etched perfectly into their memories against a canvas of fire. Tears cut clean, narrow tracks through the gray ash that dusted their cheeks. They wept for the walls they were leaving behind, for the quiet mornings they would never get back, and for the sudden, startling vulnerability of being adrift in the world. A mother wrapped a thick blanket around her young son's shoulders, pulling him close to her side. She rested her chin on the top of his head, feeling the soft, familiar texture of his hair. She looked at the glowing sky, then down at the small, sturdy shape of her child. The walls of their house were gone, the roof had fallen, but the true foundation of her life was still breathing steadily against her ribs. With a deep, shuddering breath, she turned away from the light. She took her son's hand, his small fingers wrapping securely around hers. Together, they joined the quiet river of people moving slowly into the gathering dark. Behind them, the sky continued to rain down its gentle, sorrowful embers, blanketing the empty streets and the broken stones in a soft layer of gray. Ahead of them lay only the vast, uncertain shadows of the countryside. But they walked forward, step by weary step, carrying the very best pieces of themselves, holding tightly to each other as the long, quiet night began to fall. The heavy leather boots of young men did not fall on stone today, but upon the soft, bruised stems of wild chamomile and sweet summer grass. Leaving the smoke of the ancient city far behind them, the long, quiet columns wound outward into a world that seemed entirely untouched by the sorrows of men. This was the deep Norman countryside, a sprawling, endless patchwork of sleepy orchards, ancient farmland, and vast fields of golden wheat that swayed like a quiet ocean in the warm June breeze. To walk into this landscape was to step into a beautifully painted, slow-moving dream. The earth here was heavy with the perfume of blooming honeysuckle, wild thyme, and damp, rich soil. The sky above was a brilliant, untroubled canopy of pale blue, dotted with small, lazy clouds that cast drifting shadows across the green valleys. Nature, in all her vibrant, unbothered glory, was wearing her absolute finest summer dress, entirely indifferent to the history being written beneath her branches. But weaving slowly through this paradise was a fragile thread of olive green. There were young men, boys really, who had crossed a gray and churning sea only to find themselves swallowed whole by a sea of green. They came from the misty, winding cobblestone streets of British mill towns, from the quiet, rain-washed villages of the English shires, and from the vast, open prairies of Canada. Now, they were strangers, navigating a beautifully bewildering maze. The farmers of Normandy had spent centuries cultivating the bocage, the dense, towering hedgerows that bordered every pasture and dirt lane. These were not simple bushes, but ancient, impenetrable walls of intertwined oak, hazel, hawthorn, and thorny bramble. They rose high above the soldiers' heads, their deep roots tangled in thick, moss-covered banks of earth that had not been disturbed in hundreds of years. The hedgerows turned the rolling countryside into a series of secret, enclosed rooms. Stepping through a gap in the brush into a new field felt like opening a heavy wooden door into a quiet, sunlit sanctuary, completely isolated from the rest of the world. It was a surreal and bewildering juxtaposition. The air around them hummed not with the harsh machinery of conflict, but with the low, drowsy buzzing of honeybees drifting lazily between the delicate petals of wild red poppies. White butterflies danced in the golden, dusty light, fluttering past the helmets of the young soldiers who stood frozen, watching them with wide, exhausted eyes. A young Canadian boy named Thomas walked near the front of his line along a narrow, sunken dirt track. The wool of his uniform was heavy and scratchy in the breathless heat of the afternoon, his shoulders aching under the weight of his pack. But as the narrow lane opened up into a vast, breathtaking expanse of wheat, Thomas simply stopped. The wind moved gracefully through the tall, golden stalks, creating a soft, rhythmic shushing sound, a gentle, sweeping whisper that rolled across the landscape like a lullaby. He took a step forward, reaching out a trembling, dirt-stained hand, letting the bristly, warm heads of the wheat brush against his open palm. In that fleeting, sensory touch, he was no longer in a foreign land. He was instantly, vividly transported back to the endless, golden plains of Saskatchewan. He could feel the familiar, dry heat of his father's farm baking into his skin. He could hear the distant, rhythmic clatter of the old tractor, the screen door of his childhood home banging softly shut in the summer wind, and the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen. He could almost taste the cold, sweet lemonade she used to bring out to the porch when the long day of harvesting was finally done. For a precious, heartbreaking minute, the heavy shadow of the world simply ceased to exist. Thomas closed his eyes, tilting his face up to the warm sun, letting the golden light wash over his eyelids. He breathed in the scent of the grain, anchoring his weary soul to the comforting, unchanging rhythm of the earth. In that moment, he was not a soldier. He was just a boy standing in a field of wheat, deeply and profoundly homesick, finding a temporary home in the palm of his hand. The quiet of the countryside was heavy, wrapped in a strange, suspended tension, yet filled with a profound tenderness. It was a silence that demanded to be listened to. The men communicated only in soft murmurs, their voices dropping instinctively to match the hush of the ancient woods. A metal canteen was unclipped from a canvas belt, the clasp scraping softly. Water was passed down the line, a silent, reverent offering from one dry throat to another. The water was warm, tasting faintly of tin and iodine, but as it was shared under the dappled, green shade of a massive oak tree, it felt like a holy sacrament. They looked at each other, their faces smeared with dust and the deep shadows of fatigue, and shared faint, knowing smiles. There was an incredible, unspoken intimacy in this shared vulnerability. It was a quiet brotherhood forged in the simple, enduring act of putting one tired foot in front of the other, of holding space for each other's fears without ever having to say a word. During a brief halt, while the men rested in the deep, cool ferns at the base of a towering hedgerow, a young British soldier named William sat with his back pressed against the damp, mossy earth. He unbuttoned his chest pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook, its pages soft and curved from the humidity of his own body. Using the tiny, dull stub of a pencil he had carefully sharpened with his pocketknife, he began to write to his sweetheart back in a rainy, coastal town in England. He did not write about the fearful anticipation that knotted his stomach, or the terrifying suddenness of the distant, muted rumbles that occasionally fractured the horizon. He wanted to entirely spare her the weight of his reality. Instead, he wrote to her about the breathtaking beauty of the place. He described the vivid, startling red of the poppies that grew wild along the ditches, telling her in small, careful letters that they reminded him exactly of the bright ribbon she wore in her hair the day he boarded the train. He wrote about the sweet, herbal smell of the crushed grass beneath his boots, and how the twilight here felt so peaceful. He told her how much he missed the simple, comforting sound of the kettle boiling on her stove, and the damp, salty smell of the ocean breeze blowing through her open window. He poured all his love, his profound longing, and his desperate, quiet hope for a peaceful tomorrow into those tiny, hurried pencil strokes. When he finally signed his name, carefully folded the paper, and tucked it securely back into the pocket over his heart, he felt a little lighter. It was as if a tiny, invincible piece of her was now walking beside him, holding his hand in the vast, green maze. A few yards away, a young medic sat perfectly still, his chin resting on his knees. A small, vibrant blue butterfly had fluttered down from the canopy and landed gently on the canvas strap of his medical kit. He watched it with a quiet, breathless awe. Its wings opened and closed slowly, completely fragile, completely beautiful, and entirely oblivious to the heavy red cross painted on the bag it rested upon. In that tiny, perfect creature, the medic saw the delicate, precious nature of life itself. He did not move a muscle until the butterfly finally lifted back into the air, spiraling up toward the sunlight, carrying his silent prayers with it into the blue. As the long afternoon slowly wore on, the heat of the day began to soften and break. The sun dipped lower in the sky, turning the light from a harsh, bright yellow into a soft, liquid, honeyed gold. This was the golden hour, the magical time of day when the Norman countryside looked its most forgiving and serene. The long shadows of the hedgerows stretched far across the fields, creating cool, dark stripes against the glowing, amber wheat. The leaves of the apple orchards caught the fading light, shimmering like thousands of small, fragile emeralds in the gentle evening breeze. The young soldiers continued their slow, deliberate advance, their silhouettes outlined softly against the setting sun. They moved with a quiet, shuffling reverence, almost as if they were afraid to wake the sleeping earth. The natural world around them remained a sanctuary of peace. The birds continued to sing their evening songs from the high branches, a sweet, cascading trill that filtered down through the leaves like a blessing. The crickets began their rhythmic chirping in the tall grass, a steady, comforting heartbeat that filled the cooling, fragrant air. It was a profound and beautiful mystery. Here, amid the creeping shadow of the world's sorrows, the earth offered up a boundless, quiet grace. The blooming wildflowers, the ancient, twisting roots of the hawthorn trees, the soft, forgiving soil, they did not judge the young men who walked upon them. They simply absorbed their weary footsteps, offering a fleeting, fragrant embrace to the boys who were so very far from home. And so, they walked on into the twilight. The scent of crushed chamomile slowly faded into the damp, rich, earthy smell of the approaching night. The fields of golden wheat turned to a soft, whispering silver under the rising light of the moon. In the hearts of these young men, carrying the heavy weight of the unknown on their shoulders, there remained a quiet, flickering, and unbreakable resilience. They found their strength in the memory of a father's farm, in the folded letter kept close to the chest, and in the simple, shared comfort of a friend walking quietly by their side. They were held gently in the vast, indifferent beauty of the summer fields, entirely surrounded by the whisper of the wind, moving softly, ever so softly, toward the resting dark. Beneath the burning sky, the earth opened her quiet, ancient arms to catch the falling pieces of a broken city. As the familiar streets of Caen surrendered to the ash and the embers, a vast and silent migration began to flow away from the broken cobblestones. They moved like a gentle, weary river into the deep, welcoming shadows of the countryside. Their destination was not a distant town or a fortified stronghold, but the very foundation of their history. Just beyond the city limits lay the ancient limestone quarries of Fleury. For centuries, these silent, subterranean caverns had yielded the pale, beautiful stone that built the grand abbeys and the sturdy homes of the valley above. Now, in a poetic, heartbreaking turn of fate, the stone that had built their city was waiting in the dark to offer them sanctuary. Leaving the chaotic, glowing twilight of the surface, the families stepped down into the cool, damp mouth of the earth. The transition was profound and immediate. The heavy, smoke-filled air was suddenly replaced by the crisp, mineral scent of raw chalk and wet soil. The terrifying roar of the world above was instantly muffled, swallowed by the thick, insulating layers of bedrock. As they walked deeper into the winding, cavernous tunnels, the last rays of the amber sun faded away, replaced by a profound, velvety darkness that wrapped around them like a heavy, protective blanket. They stepped into a world composed entirely of shadows and whispers. The quarries were a vast, echoing labyrinth, a cathedral of uncarved rock with ceilings that disappeared into the gloom. Into this quiet void poured thousands of displaced souls. They arrived carrying meager bundles of clothing, clutching small, precious keepsakes, and holding tightly to the hands of their children. They found empty alcoves and smooth patches of stone floor, slowly setting down their burdens and claiming tiny islands of space in the dark. Slowly, the darkness was pierced by a constellation of small, fragile lights. Candles were struck. Tiny kerosene lanterns were turned up just enough to cast a pale, golden glow against the rough-hewn walls. From a distance, the cavern looked like a sky full of fallen stars, each flickering light representing a family huddled closely together for warmth and comfort. In this subterranean village, time entirely lost its shape. There was no sunrise to announce the morning, no sunset to draw the day to a close. There was only the continuous, gentle present. The silence of the quarry was not empty, it was filled with the soft, oceanic murmur of humanity. It was the sound of 1,000 whispered conversations blending together, echoing gently off the damp stone walls. It was a symphony of survival, composed of hushed prayers, the rustle of woolen blankets, and the slow, steady rhythm of breathing. Every now and then, the earth around them would tremble. A deep, distant shudder would vibrate through the limestone pillars, a muffled reminder of the storm still raging far above their heads. When the ground shook, the sea of whispers would momentarily pause. Hands would instinctively reach out in the dim light, finding a shoulder to hold, a knee to rest upon, a set of fingers to interlace. They held their collective breath, suspended in a shared, quiet fear, waiting for the vibration to pass. And when it did, the soft murmurs would slowly begin again, a beautiful, stubborn refusal to be silenced by the dark. It was here, in the dim and dusty light, that the truest and most beautiful acts of everyday heroism quietly unfolded. They were not grand gestures of defiance, but tiny, exquisite moments of sacrifice and love. In a shallow alcove near the main tunnel, a mother named Elaine sat upon a folded tapestry she had pulled from her living room wall just hours before. Around her, her 3 young children lay curled together like sleeping kittens, their faces pale in the candlelight. In her lap, resting on a clean linen cloth, was a single, small heel of dark bread. It was the last of their food. Elaine picked up a small knife, her movements slow and infinitely gentle. She did not slice the bread, she scored it, measuring the portions with the devastating, precise math of a mother's love. She cut 3 even pieces, leaving nothing but a scatter of crust and crumbs on the cloth for herself. When her youngest son stirred, rubbing his tired eyes against the glare of the lantern, she smiled. It was a soft, radiant smile that completely masked the deep, hollow ache in her own stomach. She placed the bread into his small hands, whispering that she had already eaten, that she was entirely full. She brushed a stray piece of chalk dust from his cheek and hummed a low, soothing melody until he closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep, his fingers curled tightly around his precious meal. She sat in the quiet dark, listening to the soft dripping of condensation from the cavern roof, her heart full, her spirit unbroken. She was a silent guardian, a fortress of comfort built entirely of love. The boundaries that had separated the people of Caen and the world above slowly dissolved in the damp air of the quarry. The grand titles, the social stations, the differing neighborhoods, all of it faded away, leaving only the profound, shared experience of their humanity. The wealthy merchant shared his thick woolen blankets with the family of a poor cobbler. The baker, who had lost his ovens to the fire, moved through the tunnels with a tin cup of water, offering sips to the elderly who were parched from the dusty air. In one corner, an old apothecary had set up a makeshift clinic on a flat slab of limestone. He had very few medicines left, but he possessed an abundance of gentleness. He moved among the resting families with a quiet, shuffling grace. When he found a woman shivering with a sudden chill, he did not just offer a blanket, he sat beside her, taking her cold, trembling hands between his own warm, withered palms. He spoke to her in a low, even voice, talking not of the war, but of the beautiful cherry blossoms that used to bloom in the courtyard of the abbey. He painted a picture of spring with his words, soothing her racing heart until her shivering finally ceased. His medicine was kindness, administered in the dark, drop by precious drop. Despite the fear that hung heavy in the subterranean air, there was a remarkable, quiet dignity in the way they lived. They kept their small spaces meticulously clean. They spoke politely to their neighbors. They tried, with all their might, to maintain the gentle rhythms of a normal life. Further down the tunnel, sitting near a small fissure in the rock where a tiny draft of fresh air seeped in, a young schoolteacher named Selene sat with a leather-bound journal resting on her knees. She held the stub of a pencil close to the flame of a single, dwindling candle. The shadows danced playfully across the pale stone beside her as she wrote. She was not writing a history of the conflict. She was writing to her fiancé, a man she had not seen since the autumn leaves had fallen. She wrote about the profound beauty of the people around her. She described the way the candlelight caught the silver hair of a sleeping grandmother, turning it into a halo of spun glass. She wrote about the sweet, echoing sound of a child's sudden laughter, a sound that briefly lifted the heavy hearts of everyone within earshot. She poured her longing into the pages, telling him how much she missed the simple weight of his hand in hers. "We are living inside the very bones of our city," she wrote, the pencil scratching softly against the paper. "It is dark, and it is cold, but my love, we are together, and our hearts are still beating. I am keeping my hope safe in this quiet place, folding it up like a precious letter, waiting for the day I can hand it back to you in the sunlight. When she finished, she closed the book with a soft, satisfying thud, tracing the embossed leather with her thumb. She blew out her candle, plunging her small corner back into the deep, velvety dark, and lay her head against the cool limestone, finding comfort in the solid, unchanging nature of the earth. To walk through the fluory quarries during those long, suspended days was to witness the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. It was a place of profound vulnerability, yes, but it was also a sanctuary of immense, quiet strength. It was found in the soft murmurs of comfort exchanged between strangers in the middle of the night. It was found in the way a group of men quietly braced their shoulders against a weakening timber support, standing silently for hours to ensure the roof above their families held strong. It was found in the gentle lullabies sung by mothers, their voices rising up to the cavern ceiling, weaving a protective net of melody over the heads of the sleeping children. Outside, the storm of history was tearing the world apart, reshaping the maps and fracturing the ancient architecture of their beloved home. But down here, entirely hidden from the burning sky, the citizens of Caen were holding their world together. They were surviving not with weapons or grand strategies, but with shared crusts of bread, whispered stories, and the warmth of a neighbor's shoulder. They became a single, breathing organism, resting in the deep, quiet womb of the earth. The limestone walls, damp with the slow seepage of ancient water, seemed to weep with them, holding them in a cool, forgiving embrace. They lay in the darkness, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of 1,000 beating hearts, waiting with infinite patience for the distant thunder to finally fade, and for the gentle call of the morning sun to invite them back up into the light. The pale dust fell like a quiet, forgotten snow over the broken stones of the city. As the young men moved away from the golden, whispering fields of the Norman countryside, they found themselves stepping into an entirely different world. The lush, vibrant greens of the summer hedgerows slowly gave way to the muted, monochromatic gray of the outer suburbs of Caen. Here, the landscape was no longer shaped by ancient oak trees and blooming chamomile, but by the jagged, weary silhouettes of shattered stone and splintered timber. The city, which had once hummed with the gentle rhythms of daily life, now sat in a state of suspended, heavy slumber. To walk these streets was to navigate a ghostly echo of a world that had been abruptly paused. The cobblestones, once polished smooth by centuries of wooden cartwheels and the hurried footsteps of children running to the bakeries, were now blanketed in a thick, soft layer of pale plaster dust. It coated everything. It settled on the wrought iron balconies, it frosted the leaves of the few surviving linden trees, and it dusted the shoulders of the young soldiers who moved through the narrow alleys with the slow, careful grace of sleepwalkers. There is a very specific, profound silence that follows in the wake of a skirmish. It is not an empty silence, but a heavy, ringing stillness that presses against the ears and settles deep into the chest. It is the sound of the earth holding its breath, waiting for the dust to settle. In this quiet aftermath, the air smelled entirely of pulverized limestone, old, dry wood, and the faint, sweet scent of extinguished fires. A young soldier named Elias walked near the crumbling wall of what used to be a small, corner grocery store. His uniform, once a crisp olive green, was entirely completely covered in the pale ash of the city, turning him into a slow-moving phantom. He was so young, his cheeks still carrying the soft curve of youth beneath the smudges of dirt and fatigue. But his eyes held a profound, bottomless exhaustion. It was an exhaustion that went far beyond the aching of muscles or the blistering of heels. It was a weariness of the soul, a heavy, sinking feeling that made the simple act of lifting his heavy canvas boots feel like an insurmountable task. Elias found a small, intact stoop leading up to a doorway that no longer held a door. He sat down heavily, the breath leaving his lungs in a long, shuddering sigh. He unclasped the heavy steel helmet from his head and rested it on the ground beside him. He ran a trembling, dirt-stained hand through his damp hair, closing his eyes against the stinging, dusty air. For a moment, he let himself completely sink into the stillness. He listened to the soft, rhythmic crunch of his comrades' boots further down the street, a slow, mesmerizing sound that blended with the gentle sigh of the wind moving through the empty window frames. He wanted nothing more than to simply fall asleep, right there on the hard, dusty stone. He dreamed of his small bed in a quiet coastal town in Cornwall, of the cool, crisp linen sheets smelling of sea salt and lavender soap. He could almost feel the coastal breeze coming through his open window, carrying the distant, comforting sound of the tide rolling in over the pebbles. As he opened his heavy eyes, pulling himself back to the reality of the ruined street, a small splash of color caught his attention. It was jarring against the endless sea of pale gray. Half buried beneath a pile of shattered roof slates and pulverized mortar, just a few feet from his heavy boots, lay a small object painted in bright, cheerful red and blue. Elias leaned forward slowly, his joints popping in the quiet air. He reached out and gently brushed the debris away with his fingertips. It was a wooden toy boat. It was small enough to fit perfectly in the palm of a child's hand, with a tiny, carved smokestack and a hull painted a vibrant, ocean blue. The paint was chipped at the edges, worn smooth by the loving friction of small, eager hands. He picked it up, cradling it in his rough, calloused palms. The wood felt surprisingly light. He used the edge of his thumb to wipe the pale dust from the little red smokestack. In the palm of his hand, this tiny, fragile object held a heartbreaking amount of gravity. It was a bridge between the grim reality he was navigating and the innocent, domestic life that had thrived here just weeks before. Holding the boat, Elias could almost see the ghost of the child who had owned it. He imagined a little boy in short woolen trousers, running down this very cobblestone street after a heavy spring rain. He pictured the boy kneeling by the edge of the road, placing the little blue boat into a rushing puddle, his face alight with simple, uncomplicated joy, entirely unaware of the storm clouds gathering on the horizon of the world. A lump rose in Elias's throat, thick and hard. He did not feel anger, and he did not feel the fiery rush of conflict. He felt only a profound, weeping tenderness. He thought of his own little brother back home, who had a similar wooden boat that he sailed in a metal bathtub on Sunday evenings. The lines between his own family and the unseen family of this ruined house blurred completely. They were all just people, fragile and beautiful, trying to build small moments of happiness in a fragile world. With slow, reverent care, Elias did not toss the toy back into the rubble. He stood up, his legs trembling slightly with the effort, and walked over to a surviving stone windowsill. He used his sleeve to sweep the dust and broken glass away, creating a small, clean space. He placed the little wooden boat gently in the center of the sill. It was a tiny, almost invisible act of restoration. He could not rebuild the house, and he could not undo the sorrow that had swept through the city, but he could rescue this one small piece of joy from the dirt. He left it there, a bright beacon of blue and red against the gray, waiting faithfully for the child's return. Further down the street, the long afternoon slowly began to stretch into the evening. The harsh, bright light of the day softened, filtering through the dust haze to cast a warm, golden glow over the ruins. It turned the pale plaster into shades of soft peach and gentle lavender. In the shadow of a fallen garden wall, another soldier named Thomas sat with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He was gently unrolling a piece of paper he had found fluttering like a trapped moth against a broken iron gate. It was not a military document. It was a piece of civilian stationery, adorned with a faint, elegant floral border. The handwriting was looped and graceful, written in faded blue ink. It was a simple, mundane letter, likely dropped in the hurried, frightening moments of evacuation. Thomas read the delicate French script, sounding the words out softly under his breath. It was a letter from a mother to her sister in the countryside. She wrote about the warm weather, about how her tomato plants were finally beginning to sprout in the backyard, and she asked if her sister could perhaps spare a little extra sugar the next time she visited. She mentioned that her husband was repairing the roof on the shed, and that the children were growing too tall for their shoes. Thomas traced the ink with his finger. There was no mention of fear, no mention of the armies gathering across the sea. Just the quiet, beautiful poetry of an ordinary life. Reading it grounded him. It reminded him that beneath the rubble and the ash, this city was made of love, of scraped knees, of shared sugar and backyard gardens. He folded the paper with infinite care, as if it were a sacred relic, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform. He would carry it for them. He would keep their ordinary, beautiful memories safe against his own beating heart. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the outer suburbs of Caen fell into a deep, velvety twilight. The dust that hung in the air caught the silver light of the rising moon, making the streets look as if they were submerged underwater, quiet and glowing. The young men, entirely spent, began to wrap themselves in their heavy wool blankets, finding small, sheltered corners among the stones to rest their weary heads. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry leaves of the linden trees and whispering softly through the empty doorways. It was a lonely sound, but also a peaceful one. The city was wounded, yes, but it was finally resting. Elias pulled his blanket up to his chin, his back resting against the cool, solid stone of the grocery store wall. He looked down the street, his eyes heavy with approaching sleep. He could just barely make out the silhouette of the wooden window sill, and the tiny, steadfast shape of the little blue boat sitting upon it. He closed his eyes. The ringing in his ears began to fade, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing, and the quiet, synchronized breathing of his friends sleeping nearby. In the gentle, cooling dark, the dust on the cobblestones finally settled. The young men slept, cradled in the ruins of a stranger's home, bound together by the quiet resilience of the human spirit, dreaming of peace, of calm waters, and of the long, hopeful road that would eventually lead them all back into the light. When the pendulums finally ceased their rhythmic swinging, time did not stop, it simply unspooled, drifting like smoke through the ruined streets and damp cellars. In the days before the storm, the hours of the city were measured by beautiful, familiar things. Time was the scent of the baker's first fire kindling in the quiet dawn. It was the long, golden shadows that stretched across the cobblestones in the late afternoon. It was the deep, resonant tolling of the abbey bells calling the faithful to evening prayer. But now, those comforting markers had vanished, replaced by an endless, heavy gray twilight. The sun still rose and set, hidden behind a thick veil of ash and dust, but down in the earth, and out in the fractured ruins, day and night simply blurred into one continuous, suspended moment. This was the quietest, heaviest burden of all, the waiting. Beneath the streets, in the cool, vaulted cellars, and the deep limestone quarries, the trapped citizens of Caen sat in the dim light of rationing candles. The air down here was thick with the scent of damp earth and huddled bodies, and it was entirely removed from the turning of the earth above. In one small, shadowed corner, an older gentleman named Arthur sat on a wooden crate. In his hands, he held a silver pocket watch. Its glass face was cracked, and the hands were permanently frozen at 3:15. It had not ticked in days. Yet, out of a profound, comforting habit, Arthur's thumb gently stroked the small winding knob at the top. He sat with his eyes closed, his head resting back against the cold stone wall. He did not need the watch to tell him the time, he only needed it to remind him of the shape of his former life. He remembered how he used to check it as he walked to the market to buy fresh pears for his wife. He remembered the satisfying, rhythmic click it made when he closed the silver casing. In the heavy silence of the cellar, Arthur pulled a folded piece of paper from his wool coat. He had no envelope, and no postman would come down into the dark to collect it, but he needed to write. He found a small, dull pencil in his pocket, and leaning close to a dying candle, he began a letter to his daughter, who had traveled to the countryside before the skies had turned dark. He did not write to her of the fear that gripped his chest, or the way the earth shuddered when the distant thunder rolled. He wrote to her of peace. He wrote in slow, deliberate cursive, telling her that he had found her old, blue woolen scarf packed in a trunk, and that her mother was keeping it wrapped around her shoulders to stay warm. He wrote that they were safe, that they were together, and that they were simply waiting for the morning to come. He poured all of his gentle, fatherly reassurance into the lead of the pencil, creating a fragile paper bridge between the dark cellar and the sunlit fields where he hoped she was safely sleeping. When he finished, he folded the letter into a tiny, perfect square and tucked it into the watch pocket of his vest, right over his heart. It was a silent promise, kept warm against his chest. Above the cellars, out in the broken landscape of the outer suburbs, the suspension of time felt just as profound to the young soldiers dug into the earth. The world had shrunk. It was no longer a map of vast continents or sprawling oceans. The entire universe was reduced to a few yards of dirt, a crumbling stone wall, and the patch of gray sky directly overhead. In a shallow trench carved beside a ruined farmhouse, a young soldier named Julian sat with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. The heavy wool of his uniform was damp with the evening mist. The quiet of the front line was a strange, ringing stillness. It was the kind of quiet that makes a man acutely aware of his own heartbeat and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the friends sleeping nearby. Julian unbuttoned the breast pocket of his tunic. His hands were covered in the pale, chalky dust of the city, but he wiped them carefully on his trousers before reaching inside. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a flashlight. He draped his heavy canvas coat over his head and shoulders, creating a tiny, private tent in the trench, and turned the flashlight on. The beam was weak, glowing with a soft, warm amber light. In this tiny pocket of illumination, completely hidden from the vast, broken world outside, Julian began to write to his wife. He stared at the blank page, the pencil hovering in his trembling fingers. What do you say when time has stopped? He found that he could not remember the grand ideals that had brought him across the sea. All he could remember were the smallest, most beautiful details of his home. He wrote about the way the wooden floorboards creaked in their hallway just outside the kitchen. He wrote about the smell of her lavender soap, and the way the morning light caught the stray hairs at the nape of her neck when she stood by the window washing teacups. I never knew, he wrote, his handwriting small and cramped in the cold, that paradise was simply sitting at our kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, watching you read the paper. That is all I want. I do not need the world. I only need our small, quiet room, and the sound of your voice telling me that the tea is ready. He stopped writing and closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. In the damp, earthy smell of the trench, he tried with all his might to summon the scent of his own home. He wanted to hold her so desperately that the longing felt like a physical ache in his bones. He signed his name, his hand lingering on the paper as if the page itself could somehow transmit the warmth of his touch across the ocean. He switched off the flashlight, plunging himself back into the velvety dark of the trench. He folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. He knew there was no mail leaving this place. But the act of writing it, the act of sending his love out into the quiet universe, was an anchor that kept him from drifting away into the endless gray waiting. Across the shifting, invisible lines of the city, a similar scene unfolded in the shadow of an ancient, fallen oak tree. A young German soldier named Lucas sat on his helmet, his back pressed against the thick, rough bark of the trunk. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting delicate, silver shadows across his pale, exhausted face. Lucas was barely 19 years old, far from the towering pine forests and crisp mountain air of his home. He, too, felt the crushing weight of the paused clock. The days bled together in a haze of fatigue and quiet apprehension. He reached into his pack and withdrew a crumpled piece of stationery. He did not have a flashlight, so he relied on the soft, ethereal glow of the moon. He wrote a letter to his mother. He did not write of the ruined city before him. Instead, he painted a picture of his childhood for her. He asked if the old hunting dog still slept by the hearth, and if the wild strawberries had begun to grow along the fence line of their property. He wrote that he was taking good care of his socks, just as she had instructed him, and that he thought of her cooking every evening when the sun went down. In the pale light, his handwriting was fragile, delicate. He was pouring his youth, his homesickness, and his desperate desire for the simple comfort of his mother's embrace onto the page. He wrote, "When I come home, I will help you fix the gate, and I will never complain about the chores again. I just want to sit on the porch and listen to the wind in the pines." He folded the letter with meticulous care, ensuring the edges met perfectly, and placed it inside a small tin box he kept in his tunic. It sat alongside a dried flower he had picked weeks ago. It was his treasure chest of ordinary miracles, a shield of memories he carried against the dark. This was the shared, secret life of the city. Under the ground, in the ruins, and in the trenches, the true history of the waiting was being written in millions of unsent words. These letters were not records of tactics or grand sweeping movements. They were the purest, most concentrated expressions of the human soul. They were written on torn scraps of paper, on the backs of old photographs, on the margins of ration books. They were written by mothers, by fathers, by terrified boys and exhausted nurses. And every single one of them, regardless of the language they were written in, said exactly the same thing. They said, "I love you. I miss you. I want to come home." In a small, barricaded room above a bakery, a young woman named Elise sat by a shuttered window. A tiny crack in the wood allowed a single beam of moonlight to fall across her lap. She was writing in a small, cloth-bound diary. She had been writing every day since the clock stopped, creating her own internal calendar to prove that time was still moving forward. She wrote about the profound quiet that fell over the neighborhood in the deep hours of the night. She wrote about the remarkable kindness of her neighbor, who had shared a cup of precious, hoarded sugar so Elise could bake a small, unleavened cake for her younger brother's birthday. "Peace," Elise wrote, the nib of her pen scratching softly against the heavy paper, "will not be a grand, ringing bell. Peace will be the day I can hang the laundry on the line in the garden without looking up at the sky. Peace will be the sound of footsteps on the street that do not make us hold our breath. I am keeping my heart soft, despite the stone around me. I am keeping it soft for the day the sun returns." She closed the diary and rested her hands on the cover, letting out a long, slow breath. The room was entirely still. As the endless night stretched on, the millions of unsent letters rested quietly in pockets, and satchels, and against beating hearts. They were a silent, beautiful chorus of longing, rising up into the dark sky. The soldiers and the citizens alike leaned their heads back against the damp earth and the cold stone. They closed their weary eyes. The flashlights were turned off. The candles burned down to quiet, sputtering pools of wax, and finally extinguished themselves. The city of Caen lay in the deep, breathless dark. The physical clocks had stopped, their gears frozen and their pendulums still. But inside the chests of the people who waited, the true clock continued to tick. It was the steady, rhythmic drumbeat of the human heart, stubbornly keeping time, holding on to the memories of yesterday, and whispering a gentle, unbroken promise to tomorrow. They slept, wrapped in the comforting embrace of their own written words, waiting for the dawn to gently turn the page. The first heavy drop of rain fell not with a crash, but with a soft, dull tap against the brim of a rusted tin helmet. For weeks, the landscape had been defined by a dry, suffocating heat and a pale, ghostly dust that coated every surface like a forgotten snow. But as the long days of summer dragged on, the wind blowing in off the English Channel began to shift. It lost its warmth, growing heavy and thick with the scent of raw ozone and churning seawater. The sky, which had glowed with the amber light of embers and ash, now bruised into deep shades of violet and charcoal. The storm did not break with the sudden, violent fury of thunder. Instead, it arrived with a slow, creeping melancholy, a steady and relentless weeping of the heavens that would last for days. As the rain began to fall across the Norman countryside and the fractured ruins of Caen, the pale dust on the cobblestones turned instantly into a slick, dark paste. Out in the fields, the dry earth drank the water eagerly at first, but soon, the ground could take no more. The craters in the deep, narrow trenches began to fill, transforming the world into a miserable, clinging sea of heavy brown clay. The mud of Normandy was not simply dirt mixed with water. It was a living, breathing entity. It was thick and exhausting, gripping the heavy leather boots of the young soldiers with a stubborn, suctioning pull. Every step became a monumental effort, a slow, draining battle against the very earth they were trying to hold. In a narrow, winding trench just outside the city limits, a young soldier named Henry sat on a wooden ammunition crate, his knees pulled up tightly against his chest. He was entirely enveloped in the wet. His heavy wool uniform, designed to keep him warm, had become a burdensome sponge, soaking up the cold rain until it weighed heavily against his tired shoulders. The icy dampness seeped through his canvas jacket, through his woolen sweater, and settled deep into his bones. There is a profound, aching vulnerability in being completely and uncomfortably cold, with absolutely nowhere to go to find warmth. The world had shrunk to the size of a puddle at the bottom of a trench. Henry pulled his waterproof ground sheet over his head, creating a tiny, fragile tent of dark green canvas. The rain drummed against the fabric just inches above his ears, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that sounded like thousands of tiny fingers tapping against a window pane. Beneath the canvas, the air was close and smelled intensely of wet wool, damp earth, and the metallic tang of unwashed skin. Next to him, shoulder to shoulder, sat his friend James. They did not speak. In the draining, exhausting reality of the relentless rain, words simply took too much energy. They communicated in the silent language of shared endurance. A slight shift of weight to offer the other more room. A gentle nudge of an elbow to ensure the other was still awake. James reached into the inner breast pocket of his tunic, his hands moving with slow, trembling care. His fingers, pale and wrinkled from the wet, fumbled with a small, flat tin. He opened it to reveal two slightly crushed, but miraculously dry, cigarettes. He offered one to Henry with a quiet, knowing look. Lighting a match in the damp, swirling air of a trench was an act of delicate devotion. James struck the match against the tin. It flared to life with a soft, wonderful hiss, a tiny, brilliant star of orange and yellow in the gray gloom. Both men leaned in instantly, cupping their cold, muddy hands around the flame to shield it from the drafting wind, their faces illuminated by the warm, flickering glow. For a few fleeting seconds, looking at each other across the tiny fire, they were not soldiers trapped in a flooded crater. They were just two boys sharing a secret light in the dark. Henry drew the smoke deep into his lungs, feeling the sudden, beautiful rush of warmth spread through his chest. He closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the muddy wall behind him, exhaling a long, slow cloud of white smoke that mingled with the cold mist of his own breath. They passed the cigarette back and forth in total silence. That small, glowing ember was the center of their universe. It was a tiny, portable hearth fire. It tasted of dry tobacco and comfort, entirely pushing back the misery of the freezing rain for just a few precious minutes. In the gentle, shared ritual of the smoke, they found a profound sanctuary. It was a small moment of grace, a quiet rebellion against the cold, proving that even in the deepest mud, human connection could spark a fire. When the physical world becomes too difficult to bear, the human mind retreats to the places it loves best. As Henry sat shivering beneath his canvas sheet, he closed his eyes and began to meticulously construct a memory, brick by brick, until it was real enough to step inside. He thought of the small cottage where he grew up, tucked away in a quiet, green valley. He imagined the heavy stone fireplace in the center of the sitting room. He could see the dry, seasoned oak logs crackling and spitting sap, the flames dancing in mesmerizing shades of gold and blue. He focused on the memory of the heat radiating outward, warming the braided rug on the floor. He could almost smell the comforting aroma of his mother's stew simmering in the iron pot, rich with the scent of roasted root vegetables and thyme. He pictured the family sheepdog resting its chin on its paws right nearest the fire, completely relaxed and entirely dry. Henry wrapped his arms tightly around his own shivering chest, pulling the warm memory closer, draping it over his cold shoulders like a thick, heavy quilt. He lived inside that memory for hours. It was an everyday heroism of the mind, the quiet, stubborn endurance of a boy keeping his spirit alive by feeding it the warmth of a distant home. Down in the city, beneath the fractured streets, the storm was making its way into the deep cellars and ancient quarries. The limestone, so beautifully solid in the dry heat, now began to weep. The rain seeped through the cracks in the cobblestones above, traveling down through the earth until it gathered on the arched ceilings of the subterranean shelters, forming heavy, glittering drops. A grandmother named Beatrice sat on a makeshift bed of layered rugs, listening to the new sounds of the dark. Plink! Plunk! The steady dripping was a melancholic melody echoing off the damp stone walls. Beside her, she had arranged a mismatched collection of porcelain teacups, a dented brass pot, and a cracked ceramic bowl to catch the falling water. She watched the ripples form in the bottom of a delicate teacup painted with faded pink roses. Her joints ached with the deep, penetrating chill of the damp cellar, and her woolen shawl felt heavy and lifeless around her thin shoulders. But when her young grandson shifted restlessly beside her, frightened by the cold water splashing near his foot, Beatrice did not complain. She reached out and stroked his hair, her hand gentle and steady. "Listen to the music," she whispered, her voice a soft, soothing hum in the dark. "The earth is just taking a long drink. It is washing the streets for us, making them clean for when we go back up." She began to tell him a story, keeping her voice low and rhythmic, perfectly matching the cadence of the dripping water. She told him of a summer many years ago, before the shadows came, when the sun had baked the city so fiercely that the air shimmered above the pavements. She described the feeling of walking barefoot across the warm, sun-baked grass of the Abbey Gardens. She talked about the taste of cold, sweet cherries picked fresh from the tree, the juice staining their fingers red. She poured the warmth of her own history into the boy's ears. She painted the darkness with the brightest colors of her memory, distracting him from the dampness of the stone and the chill in his toes. Slowly, the boy's shivering ceased. He rested his head against her arm, his breathing slowing as he drifted into a sleep filled with sunlit gardens and warm summer breezes. Beatrice sat awake for a long time after, pulling her shawl a little tighter, guarding his dry dreams in the dripping dark. For days, the rain fell without ceasing. It washed the pale dust from the ruined buildings, revealing the true, stark gray of the shattered stone. It turned the winding dirt lanes into impassable rivers of brown sludge. The world was entirely devoid of color, reduced to shades of gray, brown, and the dull silver of the falling water. Yet, in the midst of this profound physical misery, the soft heartbeat of humanity continued to pulse with a quiet, beautiful resilience. It was found in the way a medic out in the trenches would gently wrap a piece of dry, clean linen around a wounded boy's hand, ensuring the knot was tied just perfectly to keep the mud away. It was found in the letters written on damp, curling paper, the ink smudging under the humidity, carrying desperate, loving words that refused to be washed away. It was the quiet endurance of simply existing. It was the bravery of waking up completely soaked, your muscles screaming in protest, and choosing to sit up anyway. It was the simple, profound act of looking at the person shivering next to you, offering a tired, mud-streaked smile, and passing them the last dry cigarette. The rain through the rubble was a heavy, sorrowful curtain that draped over the city and the fields. It was a baptism of cold and mud. But beneath the canvas ground sheets, inside the weeping cellars, and within the quiet chambers of the human heart, small, invincible fires continued to burn. They were fueled by the memories of dry hearths, the comfort of whispered stories, and the gentle, unbreakable bonds of love that tethered them all to the hope of a brighter, warmer dawn. When the world above forgot how to be gentle, the shadows below learned how to sing. Deep beneath the fractured cobblestones and the ruined spires, hidden entirely from the heavy, ash-choked sky, there existed a secret, subterranean world of profound and quiet grace. Down in the vaulted cellars and the ancient, winding tunnels of the limestone quarries, the air was cool, still, and entirely completely removed from the frantic pace of the daylight. The darkness here was not empty, nor was it frightening. It was a thick, velvety blanket that wrapped around the exhausted citizens and the weary soldiers alike, offering a sanctuary of shadows where the broken pieces of their lives could be gently held together. In this underground kingdom, there were no grand sweeping vistas or majestic landscapes. The universe was reduced to the tiny, golden radius of a single, flickering candle. These small flames were scattered throughout the vast caverns like fallen stars, casting long, soft, swaying shadows against the pale, weeping stone. And inside each pool of warm, amber light, the very best of humanity quietly endured. In one small alcove, nestled against a curved wall of rough-hewn limestone, an older woman named Genevieve sat on a collection of heavy woolen blankets. The air around her smelled of damp earth, old cedar, and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender water she had dabbed on her wrists days ago. Huddled around her, tucked safely under the wide sweep of her heavy woolen shawl, were 4 young children. They were not all her own grandchildren. Some were the children of neighbors, entirely separated from their homes in the chaotic twilight of the evacuation. But in the cellar, such distinctions melted away. They were all simply fragile little birds, seeking shelter from the storm. Every so often, the ceiling of the cavern would release a soft, powdery snow of chalk dust as the earth above them shuddered with a deep, muffled sigh. The distant thunder of the conflict was reduced to a low, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the bedrock and into the soles of their shoes. Whenever the ground trembled, the children would instinctively press themselves closer to Genevieve, their small hands gripping the fabric of her dress, their eyes wide and reflecting the tiny flame of the candle. But Genevieve did not let the fear take root in her quiet corner. She possessed a fierce, everyday heroism, a protective magic woven entirely of love and memory. As the dust drifted down, she simply closed her eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and began to hum. It was a low, steady sound, born deep within her chest. The vibration of her voice was stronger and far more comforting than the vibration of the earth. She hummed a melody that had lived in the valleys of Normandy for generations, a simple, lilting folk song about the changing of the seasons and the gentle flow of the river toward the sea. She did not sing the words aloud, allowing the soft, continuous hum to fill the space like a warm, golden liquid. As she hummed, she stroked the hair of the little boy resting his head in her lap. Her hands, worn by a lifetime of tending gardens and kneading bread, moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. With every brush of her palm, she smoothed away the sharp edges of his anxiety. The children listened to the song, feeling the resonance of it against her ribs. In the notes of her lullaby, they could almost see the bright, green leaves of the apple orchards swaying in the summer breeze. They could almost hear the sound of the wooden carts rolling over the bridge on a peaceful Sunday morning. Genevieve built a fortress of melody around them, a sanctuary of sound that the outside world could not pierce. Her song was a quiet rebellion against the dark, an unbreakable promise that beauty still existed, that the earth would eventually settle, and that the morning would eventually come. One by one, under the spell of her gentle voice, the children's breathing slowed. Their tight grips loosened, their eyelids grew heavy, and they drifted into a deep, untroubled sleep, completely cradled in the warmth of her song. A few corridors away, in a wider section of the cellar where the air was slightly cooler, a different kind of quiet heroism was taking place. Here, a makeshift infirmary had been carefully arranged upon wooden crates and folded canvases. The air smelled of clean linen, harsh iodine, and the metallic tang of deep exhaustion. Moving among the resting figures was a young medic named Arthur. He had been awake for more hours than he could count, his own uniform dusted in the pale chalk of the city, his shoulders aching with a profound, sinking weariness. But when he knelt beside a wounded boy, all of his exhaustion seemed to completely evaporate, replaced by a deep, singular well of compassion. Arthur did not have the bright, harsh lights of a modern hospital, nor did he have an endless supply of pristine equipment. He had only a few rolls of clean bandages, a canteen of fresh water, and the soft, wavering light of a lantern hanging from a rusted iron hook in the ceiling. But what he lacked in supplies, he made up for in profound, unyielding tenderness. He knelt beside a young soldier who was shivering, despite the heavy wool blanket draped across his chest. The boy was far from home, entirely lost in the bewildering maze of the conflict, and his eyes were filled with a quiet, private terror. Arthur did not speak of the wounds, and he did not speak of the world above. He simply reached out and took the boy's cold, trembling hand between his own two warm palms. "I am here," Arthur whispered, his voice a low, steady current, a river of calm underneath the chaotic weather of the world. "You are safe now. Just rest." He took a small piece of clean, dampened cloth and began to gently wipe the dust and sweat from the boy's forehead. His movements were incredibly slow, deliberate, and light as a feather. With every gentle stroke, he wiped away a small piece of the boy's fear. He asked the young soldier about his home. He asked him about the color of the front door of his house, about the name of the girl he had left behind, and about his favorite meal his mother used to cook on Sunday afternoons. Arthur listened with his entire soul, nodding slowly in the amber light. He allowed the boy to step out of the damp, shadowy cellar and back into the sunlit memories of his life. In this small, sacred space, the medicine Arthur provided was entirely human. It was the medicine of being seen, of being held, and of being told that you are not alone in the dark. As the boy spoke of the rolling green hills of his hometown, his shivering gradually ceased. His tense muscles relaxed, and a faint, grateful smile touched the corners of his lips. He closed his eyes, his hand still held safely in Arthur's warm grip, and fell into a peaceful, restorative sleep. Arthur stayed kneeling there for a long time, simply watching the gentle rise and fall of the boy's chest, acting as a silent guardian of his rest. This was the quiet grace of the medics. They were the weavers of comfort, moving through the darkest corners of the earth with hands that only knew how to heal, proving that even when the world is breaking apart, the human instinct to mend and to comfort is an unstoppable force. Further into the winding labyrinth of the quarry, where the shadows were deepest, a young woman named Clara sat with her back resting against a cool, smooth slab of limestone. The sounds of the cellar, the distant hum of Genevieve's lullaby, the soft footsteps of the medics, the rhythmic breathing of 1,000 sleeping souls, blended together into a single, ocean-like murmur. Clara held a tiny, stub's end of a pencil and a single sheet of delicate, translucent paper resting on a hard-bound book on her knees. She had a solitary candle burning beside her, the flame so small it seemed it might extinguish with a single breath. But by this tiny light, Clara was writing. She was not writing a diary of her fears, nor was she documenting the days that had passed since they came beneath the earth. She was writing a letter to a world she hoped still existed somewhere above the clouds. She wrote about the profound, startling beauty she had witnessed in the darkness. She wrote about a man she had never met who had offered her the last sip of clean water from his tin cup, asking for nothing in return. She wrote about the way the elderly leaned softly against the young for warmth, and how the young wrapped their coats around the shoulders of the elderly. She described the way strangers whispered words of comfort to each other in the pitch black when the candles burned out, their voices reaching out like invisible hands to hold one another steady. "We have lost the sun for a little while," Clara wrote, her handwriting small, elegant, and perfectly even. "But in the absence of the day, I have seen the true light of the people. It does not shine from the sky, it shines from within. It is a quiet, stubborn light. It is woven into the sharing of a blanket, into the singing of a song, into the gentle holding of a hand. I am not afraid anymore, for I am surrounded by 1,000,000 tiny stars, burning brightly against the damp stone." She paused, looking up from her paper. The cellar was incredibly peaceful in that moment. The earth above was entirely silent. The air was perfectly still. She watched the golden glow of the candles reflecting off the wet limestone, creating a soft, ethereal aura around the sleeping families. It was true. The grand narrative of the world was unfolding above them, a tempest of iron and ash. But down here, in the quiet, breathing dark, humanity was writing its own beautiful story. It was a story of endurance, told not with shouts or grand gestures, but with the softest, most delicate whispers of love. Clara folded her letter with infinite care, pressing the creases flat with her thumb, and tucked it safely into the pocket of her dress, close to her heart. She blew out her tiny candle, letting the velvet darkness fold over her like a warm embrace. She leaned her head back against the stone, listening to the beautiful, rhythmic breathing of the city that had moved underground. The psalm in the cellar continued, a gentle, unbroken hum of survival and grace, echoing softly through the ancient stone, wrapping them all in the deepest, most comforting peace, until the long night finally gave way to sleep. The water of the Orne River flowed slowly, carrying the pale dust of a fractured world out toward the quiet sea. For a time, the great, grinding wheel of the conflict simply ground to a halt at the edge of this gentle, dark water. The river, which had for centuries been the flowing, beating heart of Caen, was now a deep and silent boundary. The ancient stone bridges, whose graceful, sweeping arches had connected neighbors, carried laughing children, and guided weary travelers for generations, now lay broken. Their heavy, carved stones had cascaded down into the green depths, resting quietly in the muddy riverbed. The physical arteries of the city had been severed, leaving the two halves of Caen to stare at one another across a narrow, quiet divide. A heavy, melancholic mist hung over the water in the early mornings. It was a thick, pearlescent fog that muffled every sound and softened the jagged, harsh edges of the ruined city behind them. Along the northern bank, the young men who had fought so fiercely for every cobblestone and every shattered doorway now found themselves sitting perfectly still among the damp rubble, their heavy boots resting just inches from the water's edge. The frantic adrenaline of the previous days had completely entirely washed away, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache of physical and emotional exhaustion. They sat in the cool, damp air, their rifles resting forgotten across their knees, simply watching the water move. Among them was a young boy named Samuel, a farmhand from a quiet, windy valley far across the ocean. His uniform was heavy with the river mist, and his hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly from the chill. He unhooked his metal canteen and dipped it into the shallow edge of the river, watching the ripples expand outward, intersecting and dancing on the surface. He looked across the narrow span of water. It was so incredibly close. He felt as though he could almost toss a stone and hear it land on the opposite bank. Yet, it was an insurmountable gulf. There is a strange, breathtaking torment in a stalemate. It is the heavy, emotional weight of being completely stopped by a quiet river, forced to sit and reflect on the unimaginable cost of every hard-fought inch that had brought them to this muddy bank. Samuel pulled his knees to his chest and rested his chin on his crossed arms. Through the drifting tendrils of the morning fog, he could just make out the jagged silhouettes of the buildings on the southern side. He knew, with a profound and unsettling certainty, that hidden among those opposite ruins were other young men, sitting just as he was. He knew they were breathing the exact same cool, damp mist. He knew they were shivering under the exact same pale, morning sun. This was the quiet, agonizing intimacy of the riverfront. The enemy was no longer an abstract idea, but a reflection in the water. Samuel realized that the boys on the other bank were likely just as tired, just as frightened, and just as deeply, desperately homesick as he was. He imagined a young man over there, perhaps writing a letter to his own mother, perhaps dreaming of a warm hearth and a quiet room. The realization did not fill Samuel with anger. It filled him with a profound, weeping sorrow. He closed his eyes and listened to the gentle lapping of the river against the stones, wishing with all of his heavy heart that the water could simply wash the entire terrible endeavor away. Just a few yards down the bank, half buried in the soft mud, a small, faded postcard caught the morning light. A medic, moving slowly along the line to check on the resting men, stooped down to pick it up. He carefully wiped the wet earth from its surface with his thumb. It was a photograph of the very bridge that now lay in ruins before them, taken in the gentle summers of peacetime. In the picture, the stone arches soared proudly over the water. A young woman in a flowing white dress was leaning against the stone parapet, laughing at a man holding a bicycle. The trees lining the riverbank were lush and green, and a small wooden rowboat drifted lazily in the current. The medic held the postcard delicately by its edges, entirely mesmerized by the beautiful, ordinary life it captured. To the people of Caen, these bridges were not just strategic crossings, they were the very fabric of their days. They were the paths taken to buy fresh bread in the morning, the meeting places for young lovers in the twilight, the stone pathways that connected families across the water. The severing of the bridge was the severing of their home. The medic gently placed the postcard into his breast pocket, close to his heart. He felt a quiet duty to preserve that fragile memory of peace, to keep the bridge whole and unbroken in his mind, out of respect for the city that was quietly weeping around him. Across the dark ribbon of the Orne, on the southern bank, the ruins of a small riverside cafe offered fragile shelter to the opposing men. Here, tucked beneath a fallen timber beam, sat a young German soldier named Felix. He was barely old enough to shave, his face pale and smudged with the ash of the city. He sat with his arms wrapped tightly around his chest, trying to preserve whatever warmth his tired body could generate. Felix reached out and picked up a smooth, wet river stone from the bank. It was perfectly round, polished by centuries of rushing water. It felt cold and incredibly solid in his palm, a tiny piece of permanence in a world that felt as though it were entirely falling apart. He rubbed his thumb in slow, rhythmic circles across the smooth surface. As he stared across the water at the northern bank, a heavy melancholy settled over his shoulders like a woolen blanket. He did not want to look at the ruins. He did not want to think about the vast, terrifying machinery of the world that had placed him on this muddy shore. He simply wanted to be a boy again. He thought of a small, winding creek near his childhood home in Bavaria, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth white pebbles. He remembered spending long summer afternoons wading in the shallows with his brother, trying to catch minnows with their bare hands, entirely free from the shadows of history. Holding the river stone, Felix felt a desperate, overwhelming desire to simply drop his heavy rifle, construct a small wooden raft, and paddle gently across the Orne. He imagined walking up to the boys on the northern bank, offering them his hand, and asking if they, too, were simply tired of the noise. He imagined sitting with them by a small fire, sharing a tin of rations, and talking about the dogs they had left behind, the girls they loved, and the beautiful, quiet lives they were supposed to be living. The physical distance between them was only a few dozen yards of water, but it felt like an entire universe of sorrow. As the long, slow day began to fade, the light over the Orne River turned into a soft, liquid gold, and then deepened into shades of bruised violet and indigo. The silence between the two sides seemed to thicken and settle. The sharp crack of sniper fire, which occasionally punctured the quiet, ceased entirely. A fragile, unspoken truce drifted down over the water with the evening dew. It was a shared, silent understanding between the exhausted men on both sides that for this one evening, the river would simply belong to the river. In this beautiful, suspended twilight, a tiny moment of grace unfolded upon the water. From the gathering shadows of the sky, a single, pure white dove descended. It fluttered its wings softly and landed upon a piece of the broken stone bridge that jutted up from the center of the river, exactly halfway between the two opposing banks. The bird tucked its wings and sat perfectly still, turning its small head to look out over the dark water. On the northern bank, Samuel held his breath, his eyes fixed on the tiny white shape. On the southern bank, Felix stopped rubbing his river stone and stared. For a few, miraculous minutes, hundreds of young men, divided by a terrible conflict and a broken bridge, were completely united. They were united in their quiet, reverent observation of a single, fragile bird resting in the twilight. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire fractured world seemed to hold its breath, holding space for this one tiny, perfect piece of peace. It was a reminder that beauty still existed, hovering just above the wreckage. It was a gentle whisper from the universe that the earth itself was entirely indifferent to the lines drawn by men. Eventually, the dove lifted back into the violet sky, disappearing into the gathering dark. But the profound peace it had brought remained settled over the banks. The night fell gently over the city of Caen. The stars emerged, one by one, reflecting like scattered diamonds on the slow-moving surface of the Orne. The water murmured as it flowed over the sunken stones, a continuous, soothing lullaby that washed over the weary minds of the soldiers. Samuel pulled his heavy canvas jacket tightly around his shoulders, laying his head back against a pile of soft, damp earth. Across the water, Felix closed his eyes, his fingers still wrapped tightly around his smooth river stone. The broken bridge lay in the dark beneath the flowing water, but in the quiet, dreaming minds of the boys sleeping on the muddy banks, the arches rebuilt themselves. In their dreams, the river was not a boundary, but a beautiful, shimmering pathway leading them all, finally, back to the quiet hearths of home. The twilight did not fall gently that evening. It was pressed down into the earth by a sound so deep it made the very stones forget to breathe. In the hours just before the sun slipped entirely below the horizon, the air above the city of Caen grew strange and heavy. The usual cool, evening breeze that drifted off the English Channel simply vanished, leaving behind a thick, suspended stillness. The sky was painted in delicate, bruised shades of plum and soft indigo, a beautiful, quiet canvas that betrayed nothing of what was to come. But then, the horizon began to hum. It was not a sound that you heard with your ears. It was a vibration that began deep within the soil, traveling up through the roots of the ancient oak trees, shivering through the cobblestones, and settling into the very marrow of the bones. The hum grew, slow and relentless, like the turning of a massive, invisible tide. Down in the deep cellars and the winding, subterranean limestone quarries, the trapped citizens of the city paused. Conversation ceased mid-sentence. Mothers stopped folding their meager blankets. The elderly closed their eyes and tilted their heads toward the vaulted ceilings, listening to the weight of the sky. When the shadows finally arrived, they eclipsed the fading sun. A massive, steel constellation moved across the twilight, turning the heavens into a slow-moving river of heavy metal. And then, the true storm broke. To be beneath the earth during those hours was to be entirely swallowed by a sensory overload so profound, so immense, that the mind could not fully comprehend it. There was no longer left, or right, or up, or down. There was only the shuddering, agonizing roar of the world rearranging itself. The air pressure in the caverns fluctuated wildly, pressing against the eardrums like invisible hands, sucking the breath straight from the lungs and replacing it with the dry, choking taste of pulverized plaster and ancient chalk. Above them, the sky turned into a terrifying, awe-inspiring sea of fire. The twilight was violently banished, replaced by a blinding, pulsing amber glow that pierced through the cracks in the masonry and illuminated the falling dust like millions of tiny, glowing embers. The ground did not just shake, it rolled and heaved like the deck of a wooden ship caught in a relentless hurricane. With every deep, concussive thud, the limestone pillars of the quarries groaned, a sound so heartbreakingly human it felt as though the earth itself was crying out in pain. In a small, damp corner of a wine cellar beneath a ruined bakery, a mother named Madeline sat with her back pressed flat against the weeping stone wall. The single, fragile candle she had lit earlier was instantly snuffed out by the displacement of air, plunging her small sanctuary into an absolute, suffocating darkness. But Madeline did not panic. She possessed the fierce, quiet strength that only a parent in the dark can summon. She gathered her two young daughters into her lap, folding her body over theirs to form a human shield of soft wool and warm skin. The noise was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, but she fought against it with the only weapon she had, her embrace. She placed her hands firmly over her daughter's small ears, pressing their faces against her chest so they could feel the steady, reassuring thrum of her heartbeat beneath the chaotic roaring of the earth. "Close your eyes, my darlings," she whispered, her voice lost entirely to the noise, yet still somehow felt by the children. She pressed her lips to the top of her eldest daughter's head, breathing in the scent of her hair, a scent of lavender soap and childhood that anchored Madeline to her own humanity. In her mind, she began to recite a story. She imagined a great, benevolent giant walking across the mountains, his heavy footsteps shaking the valleys, searching for a place to rest. She poured all her focus, all her love, into this silent, mental fairy tale, wrapping her children in a protective cocoon of imagination while the ceiling rained white dust down upon their trembling shoulders. The vulnerability of those huddled below was profound. They were stripped of all pretense, of all the titles and differences that had defined them in the world above. In the absolute dark of the quarries, sight was useless, and hearing was a torment. The only sense that remained true and comforting was touch. In a wide, echoing chamber of the Fleury quarries, hundreds of strangers were packed tightly together on the stone floor. When the earth began its violent trembling, an incredible, spontaneous movement swept through the crowd. Hands reached out into the black void. Fingers, cold and coated in chalk dust, searched blindly for connection. A young woman named Elodie, who had lost everything but the clothes on her back, sat trembling violently, her knees pulled tight to her chin. The sheer magnitude of the sound was breaking her spirit, threatening to pull her into a dark, suffocating panic. But then, she felt a brush against her knuckles. A hand, large, rough, and calloused by years of hard labor, gently bumped against hers. She opened her palm, and the hand grasped hers firmly. She did not know whose hand it was. She did not know if it belonged to an old man, a weary soldier, or a frightened baker. It did not matter. The grip was a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. Fingers laced together with desperate strength. A gentle, rhythmic squeeze pulsed from the stranger's hand into hers, a silent, tactile Morse code that said, "I am here. We are together. Do not let go." Elodie squeezed back, the tears finally breaking free and tracking hot paths down her dusty cheeks. All across the cavern floor, this invisible chain of humanity was forged in the dark. Hands gripping hands. Strangers becoming lifelines. In the face of a destructive power so vast and indifferent, the people of Caen answered with the smallest, most intimate gesture of solidarity. They anchored each other to the earth, proving that while stone could shatter and bridges could fall, the invisible threads that bound their hearts together were entirely unbreakable. Far above the cellars, on the muddy outskirts of the city, the young soldiers stationed in the winding trenches were also caught in the terrible awe of the twilight fire. A young corporal named Thomas crouched low in the wet clay, his hands pressed flat against the sides of the trench to steady himself as the ground bucked and rolled. He looked up toward the city. The sky was an ocean of violet, swirling orange and deep, bruised crimson. Plumes of black smoke rose like massive pillars holding up the burning heavens. It was a sight of terrible, hypnotic beauty. The sheer scale of the destruction made Thomas feel incredibly small, no more significant than a single drop of rain in a massive storm. The sensory overload was paralyzing. The air smelled of burning timber, melted iron, and pulverized ancient stone. The heat radiated outward, washing over his face in dry, suffocating waves. To keep his mind from fracturing under the weight of the spectacle, Thomas forced himself to look away from the fire. He curled into a tight ball at the bottom of his trench, closing his eyes and drawing his heavy wool collar up over his ears. He reached into his pocket and found a small, smooth pebble he had picked up from a riverbank weeks ago. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, focusing entirely on its smooth, cool texture. He sent his mind far, far away from the burning city. He thought of his wife, Clara, back in their quiet village. He imagined her standing in her garden in the early morning light, wearing her faded yellow dress, holding a woven basket filled with freshly picked tomatoes. He could almost feel the cool morning dew soaking through his canvas shoes as he walked out to join her. He remembered the soft, musical sound of her laughter, and the way she would brush a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "I am not here," Thomas told himself softly, his lips moving against the damp wool of his coat. "I am in the garden. The sun is shining. The tea is warm on the stove." He built a sanctuary in his mind, a quiet, peaceful room where the fire could not reach him. This was the quiet resilience of the human spirit, the ability to retreat into the softest, most beautiful memories when the present moment became too heavy to carry. He held onto Clara's imagined smile like a shield, letting the storm rage high above him, waiting for the sky to empty itself. For hours, the symphony of destruction played on. Time entirely lost its meaning. A minute felt like a lifetime, an hour felt like a suspended eternity. The people huddled in the dark stopped waiting for it to end, and simply learned how to exist within it. They breathed the dusty air. They held tight to the hands of their neighbors. They hummed their silent songs and dreamed of their quiet gardens. And then, eventually, the thunder began to roll away. It did not end suddenly, but rather faded like a heavy storm moving out to sea. The deep, bone-rattling thuds became distant, muffled echoes. The frantic vibration in the earth smoothed out, settling back into a gentle, exhausted stillness. The roaring sky quieted to a low, metallic hum, and then, slowly, faded into a profound, heavy silence. The silence that followed the fire in the twilight was perhaps the most staggering sensation of all. It was so thick and complete that it rang in the ears. Down in the quarries, the grip of intertwined hands slowly began to relax. Fingers uncurled, stiff and aching from hours of desperate holding. Madeline, sitting in the dark of her wine cellar, slowly lifted her hands from her daughter's ears. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the chalk-filled air. Her chest heaved with a quiet sob of sheer, overwhelming relief. She pressed her face into her children's hair, feeling the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of their backs as they slept on, safe within her arms. In the great cavern, Elodie gently squeezed the rough hand of the stranger one last time. She released her grip, her fingers brushing softly against his palm in a silent, profound gesture of gratitude. Someone nearby struck a match. The tiny, yellow flame flared to life, a fragile beacon in the immense dark. It illuminated the faces of the people sitting around it, faces painted entirely in pale gray dust, eyes wide and shadowed with exhaustion, but bright with the undeniable miracle of survival. The city above had been forever changed. The ancient spires and cobblestone streets had been battered by a tempest of unimaginable scale. But beneath the earth, the true foundation of Caen remained entirely intact. They had faced the fire, the sensory overload, and the terrifying trembling of the world, and they had endured it by simply holding on to one another. As the quiet night finally settled over the smoking ruins, the people in the dark closed their weary eyes. The earth was still. The air was calm. And in the hushed, velvety shadows, the beautiful, stubborn heartbeat of humanity drummed softly on, ready to face whatever the dawn might bring. Even when the world outside was breaking, the ancient stones remembered how to hold the quiet. High above the settling ash and the fractured cobblestones, the great spires of the Abbey of St. Etienne reached upward into the bruised and smoky sky. For hundreds of years, this beautiful, sprawling monument of pale limestone had stood as a guardian over the valley. It had watched the seasons change, watched the river flow, and listened to the gentle prayers of countless generations. Now, in the darkest hour of the city, the abbey opened its heavy wooden doors and offered the only thing it had left to give, sanctuary. From the heavens, the building bore a heartbreaking and beautiful crown. Stretched wide across the vast expanse of its slate roof was a giant red cross. It was not painted by artists, nor was it perfectly measured. It was a desperate, tender plea stitched together by the trembling hands of the city's women. They had gathered bedsheets, some white, some stained with the terrible cost of the days before, and dyed the center with whatever crimson they could find. They laid it over the ancient timber and stone, a fragile, fluttering shield of humanity asking the falling sky to simply look away. To step through the arched, heavy oak doors of St. Etienne was to cross a boundary between two entirely different universes. Outside, the air was thick with dust, heat, and the chaotic rumble of a world tearing itself apart. But the moment the heavy doors closed behind you, the noise was instantly swallowed by the vast, cool darkness of the nave. The air inside was incredibly still, smelling softly of beeswax candles, centuries-old incense, and the sharp, clean scent of iodine. The light did not glare here, it filtered gently through the towering, intricate windows of stained glass. It fell to the cold stone floor in pools of deep sapphire, rich ruby, and glowing amethyst, moving with the slow, deliberate turning of the sun. It was a sacred, heavy stillness. It was a silence that wrapped around the shoulders like a familiar, comforting cloak. The pews, where families had once sat in their Sunday best to listen to the choir, had been carefully pushed to the edges of the great hall. In their place, the vast stone floor was transformed into a sea of blankets, cots, and thin mattresses. Hundreds of wounded souls lay beneath the soaring, vaulted ceilings. Yet, despite the pain that filled the room, there was no shouting. There was no clamor. The awe of the ancient space seemed to command a hushed reverence. The sounds of the abbey were reduced to the soft rustle of linen, the gentle clink of a tin cup against a porcelain basin, and the low, murmuring whispers of the nurses moving through the shadows. These nurses were the quiet, glowing heart of the sanctuary. They were local women, shopkeepers, teachers, and sisters of the abbey, all wearing makeshift aprons dusted with chalk and exhaustion. They moved through the aisles of the wounded with a slow, gliding grace, entirely devoid of panic. Among them was a woman named Juliet. Her own home had been lost to the fires days ago, her belongings reduced to the clothes she wore and a small silver locket around her neck. Yet, she did not carry her sorrow in her hands. Her hands were instruments of pure, unyielding gentleness. Juliet knelt on the hard stone beside a young boy whose eyes were wrapped in a thick, white bandage. He was trembling, lost in the terrifying darkness behind the gauze, far from his home across the ocean. Juliet did not ask him his name, nor did she ask him about the roaring world he had left outside. She simply dipped a soft cloth into a basin of cool, clean water. She wrung it out with infinite care and gently pressed it to his forehead. She hummed a very soft, very slow melody, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her when the summer thunderstorms rolled over the valley. With every pass of the cool cloth over his cheeks, she washed away a layer of his fear. She leaned down close to his ear, her voice a soothing, velvety whisper echoing in the vastness of the stone. "You are safe now," she murmured, resting her hand over his trembling fingers. "You are resting in the abbey. The walls are thick, and the light is beautiful. Just breathe." Under her tender care, the boy's trembling slowly eased. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his body sinking heavier into the thin mattress, his grip on her hand loosening as he finally surrendered to the exhaustion. Juliet stayed kneeling there for a long time, watching his chest rise and fall, a silent guardian in the colored light. In this sacred space, the bitter lines that had divided the world entirely dissolved. The abbey did not know the uniforms of men, it only knew the fragility of the human body and the deep, universal longing for peace. In a quiet alcove near the altar, bathed in the soft blue light of a stained glass saint, two young men lay on cots situated only inches apart. One wore the tattered olive wool of the liberating armies, the other wore the torn gray tunic of the garrison that had occupied the city. Outside these walls, they were entirely separated by oceans, by languages, and by the terrible, sweeping machinery of history. But here, in the hushed and holy dark, they were simply two exhausted boys, both missing the exact same comfort of a mother's voice. For hours, they lay side by side in silence, staring up at the intricate stone arches of the ceiling, listening to the soft echoes of the sanctuary. The boy in the gray tunic began to cough, a dry, painful sound that rattled in his chest. He tried to reach for the metal canteen resting on the floor near his cot, but his arm, heavily bandaged, refused to carry the weight. He closed his eyes in quiet defeat, his breath coming in shallow, difficult gasps. The boy in the olive wool turned his head. He looked at the enemy beside him. He did not see a uniform. He saw a reflection of his own profound vulnerability. Moving slowly, fighting through the ache in his own ribs, he reached down and picked up his own water canteen. He unscrewed the cap, the metal grating softly in the quiet air. With a trembling hand, he reached across the narrow space between them and gently pressed the rim of the canteen to the other boy's lips. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The boy in gray drank the cool water, his eyes opening to meet the gaze of the boy who held the cup. In the dim, colored light of the abbey, they shared a look of absolute, breathtaking understanding. It was a fleeting, magnificent moment of grace, a quiet rebellion of the human heart proving that kindness could survive even in the deepest ruins of the world. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the vibrant colors cast by the stained glass began to soften and fade, stretching long and thin across the stone floor before slowly melting into the gathering dusk. The vast space of the nave grew darker, the soaring ceilings disappearing into deep, comforting shadows. The nurses moved through the aisles, lighting small, white candles. One by one, tiny points of golden light bloomed in the dark, reflecting in the tired eyes of the wounded and casting long, dancing shadows against the ancient statues of the saints. The abbey looked like a quiet, fallen galaxy, a universe of small, warm stars keeping the night at bay. In the gentle, flickering light of one such candle, an older local man, who had been injured when his roof gave way, beckoned a young sister over to his cot. His breathing was shallow, and his hands were entirely too weak to hold the pen. He asked her, in a voice barely above a whisper, if she would write a letter for him. The sister nodded gracefully. She pulled a small wooden stool to his side, smoothing her long skirt, and took a piece of folded parchment and a pencil from her deep pocket. She waited, her pencil hovering over the paper, her face a portrait of serene patience. The old man looked up at the ceiling, a soft smile touching the corners of his mouth. He dictated a letter not to a politician or a distant general, but to his wife, who had taken shelter in the quarries outside the city. He did not speak of the pain, and he did not speak of the fear. "My dearest," he whispered, the sister's pencil scratching softly against the paper, capturing every precious syllable. "I am resting in Saint Etienne. The stones are cool, and the sisters are very kind. I want you to know that I am not afraid. I have been listening to the echoes in the ceiling, and they sound like the choir we used to listen to when we were young. Keep your shawl wrapped tightly against the damp. I am dreaming of your garden, and the way the sun warms the tomatoes on the vine. I will see you when the dust clears. I love you." The sister finished writing, signing his name with a delicate flourish. She carefully folded the parchment, sealing his love safely within the crease, and promised to keep it safe until the roads opened again. The old man closed his eyes, his breathing slowing, a look of profound peace settling over his tired face. The night deepened. The air outside cooled, and the distant, muffled thuds of the world above seemed entirely removed from the reality of the sanctuary. The Abbey of Saint Etienne stood perfectly still, an anchor of stone in a sea of ash. The echoes that drifted through the vaulted ceilings were no longer the sounds of sorrow. They had been transformed by the ancient walls. There were the echoes of whispered lullabies, the soft sweeping of a nurse's dress, the quiet clink of a shared canteen, and the gentle scratch of a pencil writing words of love. The wounded men, from all corners of the earth, slept side by side on the cold floor, bathed in the soft, golden glow of the candlelight. They were watched over by the quiet dignity of the women who moved among them, and by the stone saints who had stood vigil for 1,000 years. Here, under the great red cross, the world was forgiven for a few quiet hours. The heavy burdens of the day were set down, and in the hushed, velvety darkness of the abbey, humanity found its breath, found its grace, and finally found its rest. When the great storm finally broke, the victory did not arrive with a roar, but with a falling, silent snow of pale, gray ash. For weeks, the northern half of the city had been swallowed entirely by the deafening tempest of the world. But now, as the heavy clouds of smoke began to slowly, gently drift away on the wind, a profound and startling quiet settled over the land. The guns, which had hammered the earth without rest, finally exhausted their breath and fell completely silent. In their wake, there was no triumphant shouting. There were no bright parades, no fluttering flags, and no joyous songs echoing through the streets. There was only the slow, rhythmic, crunching sound of heavy canvas boots walking softly over a sea of broken stone. The young men who stepped forward into the northern half of Caen did not look like conquering heroes. They looked like weary, sleepwalking phantoms. The pale dust of the shattered city had coated them entirely. It clung to the rough wool of their olive uniforms, it settled into the deep creases of their exhausted faces, and it frosted their dark hair, turning boys of 19 into old men with silver crowns. They moved with a slow, shuffling reverence, their rifles slung loosely over their sagging shoulders, their eyes wide and perfectly still. They were walking into a landscape that was entirely, heartbreakingly unrecognizable. The beautiful, winding medieval streets they had studied on their paper maps no longer existed. The boulangeries, the small corner cafes with their striped awnings, the walled gardens where children used to chase the summer butterflies, all of it had been erased, replaced by a sprawling, rolling ocean of pulverized limestone, shattered slate, and twisted iron. To walk through this gray moonscape was to walk through a graveyard of memories. The soldiers navigated over mounds of rubble that, only weeks ago, had been someone's kitchen, someone's parlor, someone's safe and quiet bedroom. They stepped carefully, instinctively trying to be gentle with the broken earth beneath their feet. In the heavy, suspended quiet, a young soldier named Julian stopped near the remains of what might have been a small courtyard. The air smelled of burnt timber, ancient, dry earth, and the faint, sweet scent of crushed lavender from a garden that was now buried deep beneath the stone. Julian stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling in slow, exhausted breaths. He looked down at the rubble near the toe of his boot. Resting in the gray ash, entirely untouched by the fire, was a single, white porcelain teacup. It had a delicate rim painted with faded blue cornflowers. Julian knelt down, his joints popping softly in the quiet air. He reached out with a trembling, dust-covered hand and gently picked it up. He held it in his palm, feeling its fragile, smooth weight. In that tiny, perfect object, the true, devastating weight of the day finally settled upon his shoulders. Julian had crossed an ocean and fought through the dense, green hedgerows to bring freedom to this place. He had carried the noble idea of liberation in his heart like a shield. But looking at the shattered landscape around him, and holding this small piece of a broken home, a deep and profound sorrow washed over him. The realization was a heavy, physical ache in his chest. To free the city, they had to destroy it. To open the cage, they had to break the very branches the bird had rested upon. He did not throw the cup away. He used the edge of his thumb to gently wipe the pale ash from the painted blue flowers. He found a piece of a stone windowsill that had miraculously remained standing, and with infinite care, he placed the teacup upon it. It was a silent apology, a tiny gesture of respect to the family who had once sat together in this space, drinking warm tea in the morning light. Further down the ruined avenue, the light of the afternoon began to soften, casting long, melancholy shadows across the craters. Another soldier, a young medic named Samuel, sat heavily on a fallen timber beam. He unclasped his helmet, resting it on his knees, and ran a hand over his face. The ash was so thick it felt like a second skin, a heavy, clinging veil of sorrow that he could not wash away. Samuel reached into his canvas pack and pulled out a crumpled piece of writing paper and the dull stub of a pencil. He needed to anchor himself. He needed to reach out across the dark water and touch the comforting reality of his own home. He began to write a letter to his mother, who lived in a quiet, coastal town where the sea breeze always smelled of salt and wild grass. He stared at the blank page for a long time. How could he explain this profound, hollow quiet? He wrote his words slowly, his handwriting small and careful. "The fighting has stopped for now," Samuel wrote, the pencil whispering softly against the paper. "We are resting in the city. But it is so quiet, Mother. It is the quietest place I have ever been. We are told that we have won this ground, but my heart feels so heavy. The dust covers everything here. It covers the stones, it covers our coats, and it feels as though it covers my very soul. I look at the ruins of these homes, and I think of our kitchen. I think of the way you leave the window open in the evenings. I am so terribly glad that our home is safe, but I weep for the people here. We have given them back their city, but we have left them with no place to sleep. Please light a candle on the mantel for them tonight. He folded the letter gently, pressing his dirty thumb along the crease, and tucked it into his pocket. He leaned his head back against the cool, damp air, closing his eyes. He let the profound stillness of the ruined city wash over him, finding a strange, melancholy peace in the simple fact that, for this one afternoon, no one was asking him to run, or to fight, or to be brave. He was allowed to simply sit, and breathe, and feel the weight of the day. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the hazy sky in soft shades of bruised peach and pale lavender, the first signs of life began to emerge from the deep earth. From the cellars and the buried crypts, the citizens of Northern Caen slowly, hesitantly pushed open the heavy wooden doors that had shielded them from the fire. They climbed the narrow stone steps, blinking against the muted, dusty daylight. They stepped out onto the rubble of their ancestral home. A young soldier named William was resting near the remains of an old stone fountain when he saw an elderly woman emerge from a nearby cellar. She wore a heavy black shawl wrapped tightly over her head and shoulders, and her face was lined with the deep, exhausting map of 100 sleepless nights. She stood on a mound of broken slate, looking out over the unrecognizable expanse of gray. William stood up slowly, ensuring his movements were gentle and completely unthreatening. He did not smile a triumphant smile. He did not cheer. He understood that this was not a moment for celebration, it was a moment for shared, quiet mourning. He slung his rifle behind his back and took a few slow steps toward her. He unhooked his metal canteen from his belt. It was dented and scratched, but it held clean, cool water. He held it out to her, offering it with both hands, a silent, humble gesture of care. The old woman turned to look at him. She looked at his dusty uniform, his tired eyes, and the canteen trembling slightly in his hands. She did not speak. There were no words in any language that could adequately hold the profound sorrow of that moment. She reached out and took the canteen, her fingers brushing lightly against his. Her skin was cold, paper-thin, and covered in the exact same gray ash that coated William's hands. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the water. Then, she lowered the canteen and met his gaze. In her dark, tired eyes, William saw an entire universe of emotion. He saw the heartbreaking grief of losing the walls that held her memories. He saw the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of surviving the storm. But beneath all of that, he saw a tiny, flickering spark of quiet grace. She offered him a small, incredibly slow nod. It was an acknowledgement. It was a silent forgiveness. It was a shared understanding between a boy who had destroyed a city to save it, and a woman who had lost her world but kept her life. William nodded back, a lump rising thick and hard in his throat. He gently took the canteen back and stepped away, allowing her the quiet dignity of standing alone in the ruins of her street. As the evening approached, the pale ash that coated the city seemed to glow softly in the twilight. It acted as a strange, gentle blanket, softening the harsh edges of the broken timber and the jagged stone. It muffled the footsteps of the men who were now wrapping themselves in their woolen blankets, finding small, sheltered pockets in the rubble to rest their weary heads. The liberators lay down in the dust of the city they had broken. They looked up at the sky, watching the first faint stars begin to pierce the hazy canopy. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of the nearby river. To the south, across the dark water, the other half of the city still waited in the shadows. The long journey was not yet over. But for tonight, the northern bank was entirely still. The heavy hearts of the young men slowed their frantic beating, finding a steady, rhythmic cadence in the quiet dark. They were entirely exhausted, completely hollowed out by the immense emotional weight of their victory. They closed their eyes, letting the soft, gray ash cradle them in the ruins. The weight of the ash was the weight of sorrow, yes, but it was also the weight of peace. It was the heavy, settling dust of a storm that had finally passed. In the hushed and tender night, the soldiers and the citizens alike breathed in the cool air, tethered together by their shared resilience, resting quietly in the pale, dusty cradle of a broken world, dreaming of the day when the green shoots of tomorrow would finally push their way up through the stone. To wrap oneself in iron does not silence the beating of a fragile heart, it only makes the echoes louder in the dark. Beyond the ruined city, where the fields of golden wheat had long since surrendered to the churning rains, a new kind of quiet descended upon the land. It was the heavy, pregnant silence that precedes a massive shifting of the earth. Into this bruised and muddy landscape came the fresh faces of young men who had not yet seen the pale ash of the northern streets. They arrived in the gray mist of early morning, their eyes wide, their uniforms still carrying the faint, distant scent of the clean ocean air. But they did not walk into this storm on their own 2 feet. They arrived encased in massive, lumbering beasts of cold steel. As the new columns gathered in the wet fields, the sheer scale of the machines seemed entirely at odds with the delicate, summer countryside. These were iron giants, painted in the muted, dark greens of the earth, designed to push through the impassable. Yet, beneath the heavy armor, behind the thick bolts and the impenetrable sloping walls, the truth of the matter was heartbreakingly simple. These invincible machines were entirely hollow, and inside their dark bellies, they carried the softest, most vulnerable cargo of all. They carried boys. To step inside one of these machines was to leave the open, breathing world behind entirely. The heavy steel hatches closed with a dull, resonant thud, sealing the young crew inside a tiny, windowless universe. It was an incredibly claustrophobic space, a cramped and shadowed room where 4 or 5 young men sat practically shoulder to shoulder, their knees drawn up, their heads brushing against the low, riveted ceilings. The air inside was thick and entirely unique. It was a heavy perfume of warm engine oil, hot grease, damp wool, and the nervous, sour scent of their own sweat. There was no natural light, only the faint, eerie, amber glow of the small instrument dials, casting long, wavering shadows across their pale faces. They could only see the outside world through narrow, thick prisms of glass, reducing the vast, complex landscape into tiny, fragmented slivers of gray and brown. In this tiny, metal cocoon, a profound and absolute intimacy was born. The crew of the machine became a single, breathing organism. They knew the exact rhythm of one another's breathing. They knew exactly how the boy next to them would shift his weight when his legs grew numb. They communicated in the dark not with words, but with the gentle bump of an elbow, the reassuring squeeze of a shoulder, and the passing of a shared metal canteen. In the driver's seat, tucked deep into the very front of the iron hull, sat a young man named Leo. He was a quiet boy, a watchmaker's apprentice before the world had called him away. He was used to the delicate, precise movements of tiny brass gears and the soft ticking of pocket watches. Now, his hands rested on heavy steel levers, his feet hovering over thick iron pedals. The contrast was entirely surreal to him. As they waited in the damp morning mist for the order to move forward, Leo reached into the breast pocket of his heavy canvas coveralls. His fingertips, stained dark with engine grease, brushed against a small, folded piece of soft linen. It was a handkerchief, embroidered in the corner with a tiny, delicate blue bird. His mother had stitched it for him by the light of their kitchen fire, pressing it into his hand on the platform of the train station before he left. Leo did not unfold it. He simply rubbed the raised threads of the little bird with his thumb. In the dark, cramped belly of the tank, that tiny piece of linen was his anchor to the gentler world. He closed his eyes, tuning out the metallic creaks of the hull, and imagined the smell of his mother's baking bread. He imagined the way the morning light used to fall across his small wooden workbench back home. He sent a silent, desperate prayer up through the heavy steel roof, asking not for glory, and not for courage, but simply for the chance to sit quietly at his bench again, listening to the peaceful ticking of a clock. Just a few feet above him, in the commander's turret, a young man named Arthur sat with his hands resting on his knees. He was the leader of this small, floating island of boys, bearing the heavy, invisible weight of their safety on his shoulders. He looked down into the dim amber light at the faces of his crew. They looked so incredibly young. Their leather helmets framed cheeks that had barely begun to need a razor. Arthur knew they were frightened. He could feel the anxious energy humming in the tight air of the cabin, vibrating like a plucked string. He reached for a small, dented tin box he kept tucked beside his seat. Inside were a few hard, boiled sweets he had saved from his rations. He took one out and passed the tin down into the dark. It was a tiny, wordless act of everyday heroism. The tin made its way around the cramped space, passing from rough hand to rough hand. The simple, sudden sweetness of the candy on their tongues was a magnificent distraction. It was a fleeting taste of childhood, a reminder of trips to the corner shop on a Saturday afternoon, entirely pushing back the heavy dread of the morning. In the dark, a soft, nervous chuckle broke the silence as one of the boys fumbled with the tin. The sound was beautiful. It broke the spell of the waiting, proving that even encased in an inch of cold steel, their humanity remained entirely intact. When the distant signal finally came, the quiet sanctuary of the cabin was instantly shattered. The massive engine situated just behind their backs roared to life. It was not a sound, it was a physical force. The deep, guttural vibration shook them to their very bones, rattling their teeth and vibrating up through the soles of their boots. The tank shuddered, a sleeping giant violently waking, and began to slowly, laboriously grind its way forward into the mud. To be inside the machine while it moved was to be entirely at the mercy of the earth. The tank pitched and rolled over the cratered landscape like a small boat caught in a violent, muddy sea. Inside, the boys braced themselves against the cold metal walls, entirely blindly trusting the driver to navigate the churning brown waves. The noise was deafening, a continuous, mechanical screaming of gears and tracks that made speaking impossible. Yet, in the midst of this overwhelming, sensory torment, they held onto each other. When a sudden jolt threw the young loader against the side of the hull, Arthur's hand shot out in the dark, grabbing the boy by the strap of his overalls and hauling him back to his seat. He gave the boy a firm, reassuring pat on the helmet. "I have you," the gesture said. "We are together." Outside, the heavy metal tracks bit deep into the soft, yielding earth. They churned the ancient Norman soil, pushing aside the bruised remnants of summer wildflowers and the shattered roots of old oak trees. They left behind massive, deep footprints in the mud, scars of their passage that would soon fill with the endless, weeping rain. From a distance, looking out over the fields, one would only see the terrifying, unstoppable advance of armor. But inside, beneath the heavy metal shells, the reality was so profoundly different. It was just Leo, dreaming of his pocket watches. It was just Arthur, handing out boiled sweets to keep the fear at bay. It was just a handful of boys, holding their breath in the dark, entirely separated from the sky and the wind, relying completely on the fragile, beautiful bonds of their brotherhood to keep them sane. As the long hours of the day ground on, the initial rush of adrenaline slowly drained away, replaced by an exhaustion so deep it felt like a physical weight pressing on their chests. The air inside the cabin grew thick and stale. The muscles in their necks and shoulders burned from the constant, jarring motion. When a brief halt was finally called, the massive engine was cut, and the sudden silence that rushed into the cabin was absolute and staggering. The boys sat completely still in the dark, their ears ringing, their chests heaving, simply absorbing the profound relief of the stillness. Arthur pushed open the heavy steel hatch above his head. The cool, damp air of the evening poured down into the stifling cabin like a rush of cold, pure water. The smell of the wet earth, the rain, and the distant river washed over them, a beautiful, natural perfume that instantly chased away the scent of the oil and the fear. The boys lifted their heads, closing their eyes and breathing in the evening air. For a few precious minutes, they were allowed to simply be human beings again. They climbed out of their iron shells and stood on the wet, muddy hulls of their machines. They stretched their aching limbs, their faces tipped upward toward the gray, weeping sky. The rain felt like a blessing against their hot, dust-covered skin. They looked at the deep, mechanical footprints they had left in the mud behind them, stretching all the way back to the horizon. It was a heavy, sorrowful path. But as they stood together in the gathering twilight, sharing a canteen of water and leaning against the cold metal of their temporary homes, they found a quiet, stubborn resilience within themselves. They were fragile. They were perfectly aware of how easily the world could break them. But they had survived another day in the dark. They had kept each other safe. They had held on to the memories of their mothers, their gardens, and their quiet lives, carrying them safely through the churning mud. As the night slowly fell over the fields of Caen, the young crews climbed back down into the bellies of their machines. They pulled the heavy hatches shut against the rain. But they did not feel entirely trapped. In the warm, close dark of the cabin, they wrapped themselves in their woolen blankets, resting their heads against the cold steel, and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. They slept to the gentle, rhythmic sound of the rain tapping against the outside of the hull, a soft, soothing lullaby for the boys in the iron boxes, dreaming of the day when they could finally walk upon the soft, green earth with their own 2 feet again. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the earth simply stopped trembling. It did not happen all at once. The great, roaring tempest of the world did not vanish in a single heartbeat, but rather, it rolled away slowly, like a heavy summer thunderstorm drifting over the horizon and out across the dark, waiting sea. The deep, bone-rattling thuds grew softer and further apart. The frantic, mechanical humming in the sky dissolved into the high, thin clouds. And then, a profound and startling stillness settled over the fractured city of Caen. To ears that had been battered by the relentless noise of history, this sudden silence was almost deafening. It was a thick, heavy quiet that rushed into the empty streets, filling the spaces between the shattered buildings and sinking deep into the muddy craters of the countryside. It was a surreal, suspended peace. In the winding, muddy trenches just beyond the city limits, the young soldiers did not move at first. They remained curled tight against the damp earth, their shoulders hunched, their eyes tightly closed, instinctively waiting for the next shudder of the ground. But the shudder never came. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the realization began to bloom in their exhausted minds. A young infantryman named Arthur, his uniform heavy with the damp clay of Normandy, cautiously opened his eyes. He looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible above his trench. The thick, angry clouds of smoke had begun to part, revealing patches of soft, pale blue. Arthur took a breath. It was a slow, deliberate inhalation, drawing the cool air deep into his lungs. For the first time in weeks, the air did not taste of sharp cordite or burning timber. It smelled simply of wet grass, overturned soil, and the faint, salty promise of the distant ocean. The relief was a physical sensation. It was the feeling of a heavy, iron weight being lifted from his chest. Arthur let out a long, shuddering sigh. He unclasped the heavy steel helmet from his head, letting it fall softly into the mud beside him. He ran his dirty, trembling fingers through his damp hair, feeling the cool breeze against his scalp. Down the line, he could hear the rustle of heavy canvas as other boys began to slowly unfold themselves from the earth. There was no cheering. There was no triumphant shouting. The quiet was too precious, too delicate to be broken. They stood up slowly, leaning against the walls of the trench, their faces tilted upward to catch the gentle warmth of the afternoon sun that was just beginning to break through the haze. They looked at one another with wide, hollow eyes, sharing a silent, mutual awe. They were entirely wrapped in the simple, magnificent luxury of simply existing in a quiet world. Down in the city, beneath the heavy layers of stone and slate, the trapped citizens felt the silence seep down into the dark. In the vaulted cellars and the deep limestone quarries, the constant, powdery snow of chalk dust finally stopped falling from the ceilings. The flickering flames of the rationing candles stood perfectly still, no longer dancing to the chaotic vibrations of the earth above. A mother named Marguerite sat on a folded tapestry in a damp corner of a wine cellar. She had spent the last 3 days with her arms wrapped tightly around her young son, her body a rigid shield against the noise. As the profound quiet stretched on, Marguerite felt the tight, agonizing knots in her shoulders begin to slowly unspool. The muscles in her jaw, clenched so tightly for so long, finally relaxed. She looked down at her boy. He was awake, his small face pale in the dim light, but the terror that had widened his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet curiosity. He pointed a small, dirty finger toward the narrow stone staircase that led up to the street. Marguerite nodded softly. She took his hand, and together, they walked up the ancient, worn steps. She did not open the heavy wooden door all the way, but just enough to let a single, brilliant shaft of sunlight pierce the gloom of the stairwell. The light fell across the boy's face, warming his cold cheeks. Marguerite leaned her forehead against the cool, rough wood of the door frame, closing her eyes and listening. She heard the soft, melodious chirping of a sparrow resting on a broken drainpipe. She heard the gentle murmur of the Orne River, flowing steadily toward the sea. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes, slipping silently down her cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the pale ash that coated her skin. They were not tears of sorrow, but tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. It was the beautiful, heartbreaking realization that the world had not entirely ended. The sun was still shining. The birds were still singing. And for this one, fleeting afternoon, they were safe. Out in the ruins of the northern suburbs, a young medic named Julian walked slowly down a street that was entirely unrecognizable. The buildings on either side had been reduced to jagged, sloping mounds of gray rubble. The pale plaster dust blanketed everything, turning the landscape into a monochromatic, sleeping ghost town. Julian moved with a quiet, shuffling reverence, his boots making soft, crunching sounds against the broken slate. He felt as though he were walking through a cathedral. The silence demanded respect. He stopped near the remains of what might have once been a small corner bakery. A wrought iron sign lay twisted in the ash, its painted letters chipped and faded. Julian sat heavily on a piece of fallen masonry, resting his elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the ground. He was so incredibly tired. The emotional toll of tending to the broken bodies of his friends had hollowed him out, leaving him feeling as empty and gray as the street around him. But as his eyes wandered over the pulverized stone at his feet, a tiny splash of color caught his attention. It was so jarring, so entirely out of place in the endless sea of ash, that Julian thought his exhausted mind was playing a trick on him. He leaned forward, squinting in the gentle sunlight. Pushing its way up through a crack between two shattered cobblestones, entirely surrounded by the heavy debris of history, was a single, vibrant red poppy. Its stem was incredibly thin, fragile and pale green, bending slightly in the gentle breeze. Its petals were a brilliant, startling crimson, soft as velvet and completely untouched by the gray dust that covered the rest of the world. It was a tiny, impossible miracle. Julian knelt down in the rubble. He did not touch the flower. He simply hovered his dirt-stained hands around it, as if trying to protect its delicate warmth from the cold stone. He stared at the bright red petals, and a lump rose thick and hard in his throat. In that fragile little bloom, Julian saw the entire, stubborn resilience of life. The massive armies of the world had rolled over this street, tearing the architecture of the city to pieces, bringing fire and thunder and iron. But they could not stop this one, tiny seed from finding the light. They could not stop the earth from remembering how to be beautiful. Julian smiled. It was a small, trembling smile, but it was the first time his face had remembered how to make that shape in weeks. He reached for his metal canteen, unscrewed the cap, and carefully, reverently, poured a few precious drops of water onto the dry, ashen earth at the base of the stem. He left the flower there, a tiny, glowing beacon of hope in the gray ruins, a reminder to every tired boy who walked past that the earth would eventually heal. As the afternoon slowly melted into the evening, the lull in the fighting stretched out, becoming a beautiful, golden reality. The sky turned into a canvas of soft peach, pale lavender, and deep, bruised indigo. The dust that had hung in the air for so long finally settled, leaving the atmosphere clear and crisp. In the quiet trenches and the shadowy ruins, the young men took advantage of the stillness to do the things that made them feel human again. They pulled small, battered tin mirrors from their packs and used precious drops of water to wash the grime from their faces. They heated tins of stew over tiny, smokeless flames, the rich, comforting smell of the food drifting through the cool evening air. And, by the soft, fading light of the dusk, they wrote. A young corporal named Elias sat on a wooden crate, an old, leather-bound journal resting on his knees. He held a tiny stub of a pencil, his handwriting small and neat. He was writing to his wife, who waited for him in a quiet, coastal village across the water. My dearest, Elias wrote, the pencil scratching softly against the thick paper. The world has finally gone quiet today. I cannot fully explain to you the weight of this silence. It feels like a cool, damp cloth pressed against a fevered forehead. We are resting. I am sitting under a sky that is turning the most beautiful shade of purple, and for the first time in so long, I do not feel afraid to watch the stars come out. Elias paused, looking up at the horizon. The silhouette of the ruined abbey spires stood dark and steadfast against the glowing twilight. He took a deep breath of the evening air, letting the peace of the moment sink into his bones. I know this silence might not last, he continued, pouring his fragile, aching hope onto the page. I know the storm might return tomorrow. But today, in this beautiful, quiet pause, I am allowing myself to dream of our home. I am imagining the sound of the kettle boiling on the stove, and the smell of the salt water coming through the open window. I am holding the memory of your face so tightly in my mind. This quiet has reminded me of what we are waiting for. It has reminded me that peace is real, and that it is waiting for us at the end of this long, dark road. He folded the letter gently, pressing the crease flat with his thumb, and tucked it safely into the breast pocket of his tunic, right over his beating heart. All across the city of Caen, from the boys in the muddy fields to the families in the cool, dark cellars, this same, fragile hope took root in the silence. It was the fleeting, bittersweet hope that perhaps the worst was finally over. That perhaps the great wheel of the conflict was finally grinding to a halt. They did not know what the morning would bring. They knew the shadows might deepen again. But in this quiet space between the storms, they were granted a profound and beautiful grace. They were given the time to simply breathe. They were given the time to remember who they were, to tend to the surviving flowers in the rubble, and to wrap themselves in the comforting memories of the people they loved. As the night finally fell, thick and velvety and filled with a million glittering stars, the city of Caen slept. It was not the tense, suspended sleep of the waiting, but a deep, restorative rest. The Orne River murmured its gentle, continuous lullaby. The ancient stones cooled in the evening mist. And the people, held safely in the gentle embrace of the quiet, dreamed their soft, unbroken dreams, resting peacefully in the beautiful, silent promise of tomorrow. To cross a river when your bones feel as heavy as lead requires a quiet, unbroken promise made entirely to yourself. The brief, beautiful silence that had settled over the northern ruins eventually gave way to the inevitable reality of the morning. The city of Caen was not yet whole. Across the slow, dark ribbon of the Orne River, the southern half of the city lay waiting in the mist. But as the young soldiers gathered along the muddy banks, preparing for this final passage, there was no surge of triumphant adrenaline. There were no eager shouts, no quickened pulses. There was only a profound, oceanic exhaustion. It was an exhaustion that went far deeper than the muscles or the joints. It was a weariness of the spirit, a heavy, sinking weight that had settled into the very marrow of their bones. The weeks of waiting, of the thunder, of the pale dust and the clinging mud, had hollowed these boys out, leaving behind only the most essential, unbreakable pieces of their humanity. The sky above mirrored the mood of the men below. It was a vast, unbroken canopy of soft, pearl gray, weeping a fine, continuous mist that blurred the edges of the world. The river itself seemed tired, moving sluggishly beneath the temporary wooden bridges that had been laid across its surface. The water was the color of old slate, carrying the pale ash of the city slowly toward the sea. Everything, the sky, the water, the ruined stones, the heavy wool uniforms of the men, was painted in identical shades of gray. As the order to move forward was passed down the line, it was spoken in soft, hushed tones, almost like a secret. The men stood up slowly. Their joints ached with a dull, persistent throb. Their canvas boots, coated in thick, heavy layers of clay, felt as though they were made of solid iron. They began to walk. The sound of their crossing was not a victorious march. It was a slow, rhythmic shuffling. It was the soft thud, creak, splash of wet boots stepping onto damp wooden planks. They walked with their heads bowed, their shoulders rounded under the straps of their heavy packs. Their eyes, shadowed and entirely spent, were fixed only on the heels of the man walking directly in front of them. In the middle of the swaying pontoon bridge, surrounded by the quiet murmuring of the water, a young soldier named Thomas focused entirely on placing one foot in front of the other. The mist clung to his eyelashes, and his breath formed small, pale clouds in the cool air. He was so incredibly tired that the world around him seemed to lose its sharp edges, becoming a soft, slow-moving dream. Thomas was not thinking of grand strategies or the turning tides of history. To propel himself forward, his exhausted mind had retreated to the simplest, most comforting image he could conjure. He was thinking of a specific armchair in the corner of his grandfather's sitting room back in England. He remembered the soft, worn velvet of the cushions, faded by years of afternoon sunlight. He remembered the comforting smell of pipe tobacco and old paper that clung to the fabric. With every agonizing, heavy step across the gray water, Thomas whispered to himself, "Just one more step toward the chair. Just one more step toward home." He imagined sinking into that velvet cushion, letting the absolute safety of the room wash over him. He imagined his mother bringing him a cup of hot, sweetened tea, the porcelain warm against his palms. That quiet, domestic sanctuary was his true northern star. It was the only thing powerful enough to pull him across the river. He was not walking toward a conquered city, he was walking toward rest. When their boots finally touched the mud of the southern bank, there was no sense of arrival. The landscape that greeted them was a mirror image of the sorrow they had just left behind. It was a sprawling, silent ocean of pulverized limestone, shattered roof slates, and the charred, skeletal remains of ancient timber. The streets were choked with debris, entirely erasing the familiar maps of the neighborhoods. The physical toll of navigating this broken terrain was immense. Every mound of rubble was a mountain, every deep crater was a valley. The men climbed over the shattered cobblestones with a slow, deliberate care, their bodies moving entirely on the lingering fumes of their willpower. In this landscape of pure exhaustion, the smallest acts of kindness became monumental feats of heroism. Near the ruins of what used to be a small apothecary, a soldier named William watched his friend, James, suddenly stumble. James's knees, finally surrendering to the relentless weight of his pack in the slick, treacherous mud, simply buckled beneath him. William did not shout. He did not rush. Moving with the slow, deliberate grace of the entirely weary, he stepped forward and caught his friend by the thick canvas strap of his webbing before James could hit the ground. William braced his own aching legs, taking the full weight of the fallen boy. For a long moment, they simply stood there, locked together in the gray mist. William wrapped his arms securely around James's waist, his grip firm and anchoring. He leaned his head close to his friend's ear, his breath warm against the damp wool of James's collar. "I have you," William whispered, his voice incredibly soft, a gentle vibration in the quiet air. "Lean on me. We are almost there." He did not offer false promises of immediate comfort, but he offered his own remaining strength. Slowly, together, they found their footing. William kept his arm wrapped tightly around his friend, and they continued to walk, becoming a single, four-legged creature navigating the ruins. It was a profound, silent testament to the bonds forged in the dark. When the body can no longer carry itself, the love of a friend will carry it the rest of the way. As the gray afternoon stretched into a pale, bruised evening, the forward momentum finally slowed, coming to a natural, exhausted halt among the southern ruins. The men did not dig deep trenches or build elaborate fortifications. They simply found whatever shelter the broken city offered, the lee of a fallen wall, the shallow bowl of a dry fountain, the space beneath a tilted slab of slate. They sat down heavily, the breath leaving their lungs in long, shuddering sighs. The silence that fell over them was absolute. It was the silence of men who have completely spent every single ounce of their physical and emotional reserves. In the shelter of a ruined doorway, a young medic named Elias sat with his knees pulled tight to his chest. His uniform was soaked through with the gray mist, and his hands, normally so steady when tending to the wounded, were trembling with fatigue. He reached into his inner pocket, his fingers fumbling slightly with the button, and pulled out a small, battered notebook. He leaned his head back against the cold stone of the doorframe, closing his eyes for a moment to gather his thoughts. The air smelled of wet plaster and damp earth. He found his tiny stub of a pencil and opened the book to a fresh page. He was writing to his older sister, who lived in a busy, brightly lit city far away from the shadows of this valley. He wrote slowly, his handwriting fragile and uneven, entirely reflecting the state of his weary soul. "We have crossed the river," Elias wrote, the pencil marking the paper with a soft, rhythmic scratching. "But the world here is entirely gray. The sky, the water, the stones beneath my boots, everything is painted in the color of dust and rain. I am so tired, my dearest sister. It is a tiredness that I cannot explain in words. It feels as though my very heart is heavy with it." He paused, looking out at the ruined street. In the gathering dusk, he could see the silhouettes of his friends, huddled together in small groups, sharing the warmth of their bodies. He saw a boy carefully unwrapping a dry pair of socks as if they were spun gold. He saw another gently wiping the mud from a photograph of his sweetheart. A soft, melancholic smile touched Elias's lips. He brought the pencil back to the paper. "But even in this gray place," he continued, "there is a quiet beauty. It is the beauty of the men around me. They are so gentle with one another. When one of us falls, another is always there to catch him. We are sharing our last drops of water, our last dry cigarettes, and our last ounces of hope. I am exhausted, but I am not empty. I am filled with a profound love for these boys. I am writing this to you so that you know, when this is all over, it is not anger that carried us through. It is simply the desperate, beautiful desire to finish this heavy work, so that we might all come home and see the green of the trees again." He folded the small piece of paper, the simple act taking an enormous amount of effort, and placed it safely back against his chest. The twilight deepened, turning the gray world into shades of soft charcoal and deep velvet black. The mist turned into a gentle, steady rain, falling with a soft, shushing sound against the broken stones. The Orne River flowed quietly behind them, a dark boundary they had finally crossed. The young men in the southern half of Caen closed their eyes. There was no fear tonight, only the overwhelming, narcotic pull of sleep. They wrapped themselves tightly in their damp woolen blankets, curling into the ruins of the city they had walked so far to find. Their breathing slowed, falling into a synchronized, peaceful rhythm. The rise and fall of their chests was the only movement in the stillness. They were entirely spent, having given everything they had to the gray mud and the shattered streets. But as they slept, cradled in the gentle, weeping dark, their dreams were not of the river, or the ash, or the heavy boots. They dreamed of velvet armchairs, of hot tea, of green gardens, and of the long, quiet road that would finally lead them back to the light. The final echo of thunder did not shatter the sky. It simply rolled away into the damp earth, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt entirely like a dream. The end of the storm did not arrive with a grand, sweeping declaration, nor did it announce itself with a sudden ringing of bells. Instead, it faded with a slow, exhausted grace, much like the very last, fragile embers of a dying hearth fire. For weeks, the city of Caen had been a crucible of noise, a relentless tempest of iron and ash. But as the long afternoon stretched into a pale, bruised evening, the chaotic rhythm of the world began to fracture and slow. The heavy, concussive thuds that had become the heartbeat of the valley grew distant, softening into isolated, scattered murmurs, until finally they ceased altogether. A profound, staggering quiet rushed in to fill the empty spaces. It poured into the shattered streets, it settled over the muddy craters, and it draped itself like a heavy, velvet blanket over the shoulders of the men who had survived. In the southern ruins, where the dust still hung like a fine, silver mist in the cooling air, the young soldiers simply stopped moving. The frantic momentum that had carried them across the dark waters of the river evaporated, leaving them anchored to the broken cobblestones. They stood perfectly still, their rifles lowered, their heads tilted slightly as if listening to a sound they could not quite comprehend. The only noise was the gentle sighing of the wind as it wound its way through the empty window frames, and the slow, steady rasp of their own exhausted breathing. There is a very specific, deeply human numbness that follows survival. It is a state of suspended animation, where the mind, having braced itself for so long against the unimaginable, struggles to understand that the weight has finally been lifted. The men did not cheer. They did not embrace or throw their helmets into the pale sky. They were simply too tired. They moved with the slow, deliberate care of glass figures, finding whatever flat piece of stone or dry patch of earth they could, and they sat down. A young infantryman named Thomas found a quiet corner in the remains of a walled garden. The ancient stone wall had crumbled, but a small, sturdy wooden bench had miraculously survived the tempest. Thomas sat upon it, letting his head fall back against the cool, rough masonry. His uniform was heavy with the gray mud of the crossing, his hands coated in a thick layer of chalk and earth. He sat there for a long time, listening to the ringing in his ears slowly fade, replaced by the soft, beautiful sound of absolutely nothing. He looked down at his trembling hands. For the first time in an eternity, he realized that he would get to wash them. He realized that he would get to unlace his heavy, damp boots. He realized, with a sudden, overwhelming tightness in his chest, that he was going to live. The realization did not bring a rush of pure joy, but rather a complex, aching wave of relief tangled completely with sorrow. He thought of the boys who had walked beside him, the boys who had shared their water, their stories, and their quiet fears in the dark. The empty spaces they left behind felt immensely heavy in the quiet garden. Thomas closed his eyes, a single, clean tear carving a path through the pale dust on his cheek. He wept not with loud sobs, but with a silent, gentle release. It was the weeping of a boy who had carried the entire world on his shoulders and had finally been told he could put it down. He breathed in the scent of the damp earth and the crushed roots of the garden, holding the memory of his friends in his heart, a quiet, eternal vigil in the dusk. Across the broken landscape, moving away from the city limits into the sprawling, darkening countryside, the weary defenders also felt the shift in the wind. The long, agonizing defense had finally broken, and the young men in tattered gray uniforms walked with heavy, shuffling steps toward the horizon. They did not look back at the glowing ruins. They, too, were hollowed out by the sheer, devastating scale of the days that had passed. A young soldier named Elias walked near the back of the retreating line. He was entirely spent, leaning heavily on a wooden walking stick he had fashioned from a fallen branch. His mind was blank, swept clean by the sheer exhaustion of placing one foot in front of the other. But deep within the pocket of his tunic, wrapped carefully in a scrap of oiled canvas, was a letter he had written to his mother days ago. He had not known if he would ever be able to send it. He had written it as a final whisper into the void. But now, as the cool night air brushed against his face, and the sounds of the conflict faded into the distance behind him, a tiny, fragile spark of hope began to glow in his chest. He touched the outside of his pocket, feeling the square shape of the folded paper. He would see the dark pine forests of his home again. He would sit by the hearth and watch the snow fall. The terrible chapter of the city was closing, and the gentle, ordinary life he had dreamed of in the dark was suddenly, miraculously, waiting for him at the end of the long road. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, it painted the sky above Caen in breathtaking shades of deep violet, soft rose, and indigo. The fires that had raged through the city were burning themselves out, reducing the great, terrifying infernos to small, quiet patches of glowing orange embers. These last embers cast a soft, warm light against the shattered stones, making the ruins look strangely peaceful in the gathering dark. The men in the city began to settle in for the night. But this night was profoundly different from all the nights that had come before. There was no need to dig deep, suffocating holes in the earth. There was no need to hide in the damp, claustrophobic cellars. For the first time, they were allowed to simply exist on the surface of the world. In the center of a ruined courtyard, a small group of soldiers gathered together. They gathered broken pieces of timber, old chair legs, and shattered floorboards, and they built a fire. They did not have to shield the flame. They did not have to whisper. They simply sat around the small, crackling blaze, watching the bright sparks dance upward into the velvet sky. The heat of the fire radiated outward, warming their cold hands and drying the damp wool of their uniforms. A young medic named Arthur reached into his pack and brought out a small, dented tin kettle. He filled it from his canteen and balanced it carefully on the glowing coals. The simple, domestic act of boiling water felt like an incredible luxury, a profound reclamation of their humanity. When the water was ready, Arthur dropped a precious pinch of tea leaves into the tin, passing the warm, fragrant cup to the boy sitting beside him. The boy took a slow sip, his eyes closing in pure, unadulterated comfort. They passed the cup around the circle in complete silence. Words were entirely inadequate for the magnitude of the evening. The shared warmth of the tea, the mesmerizing dance of the firelight, and the comforting presence of one another were all the conversation they needed. In the gentle light of the flames, the dust on their faces looked less like the ash of a ruined city, and more like the soft, gray shadows of a long, arduous journey. They looked at each other with a profound, unspoken understanding. They had walked through the fire together, and they had emerged on the other side. The bond forged in the crucible of those weeks was something entirely unbreakable, a quiet, enduring love that would tether them to one another for the rest of their days. Away from the fire, sitting on the steps of a broken church, a soldier named William pulled a small, worn photograph from his wallet. It was a picture of his wife, standing on the porch of their home, smiling brightly at the camera. He had looked at this picture 1,000 times in the dark, using it as a shield against the fear. But tonight, looking at it in the soft light of the moon, the image felt different. It was no longer a desperate lifeline, it was a promise. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb. He imagined the exact sound her voice would make when she saw him walking up the garden path. He imagined the weight of his own front door opening, and the smell of the hallway. The numbing disbelief was slowly beginning to thaw, melting away to reveal the tender, vulnerable core of a man who just wanted to go home. He tucked the photograph safely away, laying his head back against the cool stone step, and let out a long, slow breath. The last embers of the battle for Caen cooled slowly in the deep night. The city, completely broken and entirely exhausted, finally exhaled. The wind sweeping in from the English Channel carried away the smell of smoke and ash, replacing it with the clean, crisp scent of salt and rain. The soldiers wrapped themselves in their woolen blankets, lying down on the cobblestones and the soft earth. They closed their heavy eyes, knowing with an absolute, beautiful certainty that they would not be violently awakened in the dark. The sky above them was vast, clear, and scattered with 1,000,000 brilliant stars, a quiet, watchful canopy over the sleeping men. The guns had finally fallen silent. The thunder was gone. And in the hushed, deeply peaceful ruins, the young men surrendered themselves to a profound and restorative sleep. They rested in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the cooling embers of history, their chests rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, dreaming of the soft, green mornings and the gentle, unbroken peace that was finally waiting for them in the dawn. To leave the safety of the shadows is to be born again into a world you no longer recognize. For what felt like an eternity, the people of Caen had lived inside the deep, breathing chest of the earth. Down in the vaulted cellars, the ancient limestone quarries of Fleury, and the hushed, cavernous nave of the Abbey of Saint Etienne, time had been measured only by the flickering out of rationing candles and the steady, rhythmic trembling of the ceiling. But on this morning, the trembling had ceased. The heavy, concussive drumbeat that had relentlessly pounded the valley was gone, replaced by a silence so vast, so profound, that it rang softly in the ears. It was this absolute stillness that finally coaxed them from the dark. The ascent began slowly. There was no sudden rush for the doors, no frantic scramble toward the surface. The movement was hesitant, gentle, and filled with a quiet, lingering apprehension. In the damp corridors of the quarries, families began to gather their meager, precious belongings. Woolen blankets, entirely stiff with chalk dust and the humidity of the earth, were carefully folded. Small, battered tin cups were placed back into leather satchels. A mother gently tied the laces of her daughter's scuffed leather shoes, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate tenderness, preparing the child to walk upon a changed earth. They moved toward the narrow stone stairwells and the heavy wooden doors like a quiet, shuffling river of ghosts. The air began to change as they climbed. The thick, mineral scent of damp limestone and huddled bodies slowly gave way to a strange, unfamiliar breeze. It was air that had been baked by the summer sun, carrying the faint, salty breath of the English Channel, completely entangled with the dry, heavy scent of pulverized stone and ancient, burnt timber. When the heavy wooden doors were finally pushed open, the light of the outside world poured down the stairwells like a physical weight. It was the brilliant, unyielding sunlight of a pure midsummer day. To eyes that had grown completely accustomed to the velvety blackness and the soft, amber glow of dying embers, the sunlight was a blinding, breathtaking shock. They stepped over the thresholds, raising their pale, trembling hands to shield their faces. They blinked against the harsh, golden glare, tears instantly springing to their eyes from the sudden brightness. The warmth of the sun touched their skin that had been cold and damp for weeks, and it felt like a gentle, overwhelming blessing. But as their eyes slowly adjusted, as the blinding white glare resolved itself into shapes and shadows, the true weight of their new reality settled upon their weary shoulders. The city they had known, the beautiful, winding, medieval tapestry of their ancestors, was simply gone. Where there had once been narrow cobblestone streets lined with tall, timber-framed houses and striped awnings, there was now only a vast, rolling ocean of gray. The landscape was entirely flattened, reduced to jagged mounds of shattered slate, splintered beams, and chalky white dust. The sky, which used to be framed by the steep roofs and the familiar silhouettes of chimney pots, now seemed impossibly huge, stretching out in a vast, uninterrupted canopy of pale, untroubled blue. It was a surreal, heartbreaking juxtaposition, the pristine, beautiful heavens looking down upon a completely broken earth. A profound, stunned disbelief rippled through the emerging crowds. The silence of the morning was not broken by wailing or shouts of anger. The grief was far too immense, far too heavy for loud noises. It was a quiet, suffocating sorrow that caught in the throat and made it difficult to breathe. An elderly gentleman named Henri stood at the top of a cellar stairwell, his hands resting heavily on a wooden walking cane. He wore a woolen vest over a white shirt that was now gray with ash. For 70 years, Henri had walked the same route from his home to the bakery near the river. He knew every uneven cobblestone, every wrought iron gate, and every linden tree that shaded the avenue. Now, he stood looking out over a completely alien landscape. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft, powdery ash. He was trying to find his street, trying to orient himself in a world without landmarks. He walked slowly, navigating only by the distant, slow-moving curve of the Orne River. Eventually, he stopped near a small, uneven pile of bricks. Poking out from beneath the rubble was a twisted piece of black wrought iron, the remains of the gate that had once led to his own front garden. Henri did not cry out. He simply let his cane fall to the ground and sank slowly onto a broken stone block. He lowered his face into his rough, weathered hands, and he wept. His tears were a quiet, steady stream, carving clean, narrow tracks through the pale dust on his cheeks. He was mourning the loss of the physical tether to his past. He wept for the armchair by the window, for the wooden clock on the mantel, for the walls that had absorbed the laughter of his youth and the quiet conversations of his marriage. All of it, reduced to the dust beneath his feet. Yet, even in the depths of this shattering grief, the everyday heroism of the human spirit remained entirely unbroken. A younger woman, a stranger who had emerged from a different cellar, saw Henri sitting alone in the ruins. She walked over the broken stones, her own face pale and lined with exhaustion. She did not say a word. She simply sat down on the rubble beside him, reached out, and placed her hand gently over his trembling shoulder. She sat with him in the sun, anchoring him to the earth with the simple, profound warmth of human connection, sharing the weight of a sorrow that was too heavy for one man to carry alone. Not far away, a mother named Clara stood holding the hand of her young son, Leo. They had survived the weeks in the dark quarries, sustained only by small crusts of bread and the soft lullabies Clara had hummed in the pitch black. As they looked out over the flattened expanse of their neighborhood, Leo tugged gently on his mother's skirt. "Where is our house, Mama?" he asked, his voice small and confused in the vast, open air. Clara looked at the space where their lives had unfolded. There was nothing left but a jagged piece of a foundational wall. She felt a wave of absolute devastation wash over her, a cold tide threatening to pull her under. But she looked down at the soft, trusting face of her son. She felt the warmth of his small fingers wrapped tightly around hers. The house was gone, the photographs were burned, the heirloom dishes were shattered. But the only thing that truly mattered in the entire universe was standing right beside her, breathing in the summer air. Clara knelt down in the ash, bringing herself level with his eyes. She reached out and brushed a stray curl of hair from his forehead, offering him a soft, trembling smile. "Our house is resting, my love," she whispered, her voice as gentle as the morning breeze. "The stones got very tired, so they lay down. But our home isn't the stones. Our home is you and me. As long as I am holding your hand, we are entirely at home." She reached into the rubble and found a tiny, unbroken piece of blue ceramic tile that had once belonged to their kitchen floor. She wiped the dust from it and pressed it into Leo's palm, folding his small fingers over it. It was a tiny piece of the past, saved for the future. She stood up, lifted him into her arms, and held him tightly against her chest, letting her tears fall silently into his hair. There were tears of profound mourning for the world they had lost, completely entangled with the fierce, overwhelming tears of a mother's gratitude that her child had survived the dark. Across the city, the heavy oak doors of the Abbey of Saint Etienne swung slowly outward. The local women and the sisters of the abbey who had turned the sacred nave into a sanctuary stepped out onto the ancient stone steps. Their aprons and habits were heavily stained, carrying the physical toll of the endless nights spent tending to the wounded. They stood together on the high steps, looking out over the city. From this vantage point, the surreal beauty of their survival was breathtaking. The great spires of the abbey still reached into the blue sky, entirely untouched, while the world below had been swept away. The air up here felt remarkably clean. A young nurse named Elise rested her hand against the cool, ancient stone of the doorway. She closed her eyes and tilted her face upward, letting the golden sunlight wash over her tired eyelids. She had spent weeks moving through the colored shadows of the stained glass, listening to the whispered fears of young men far from home. Now, feeling the sun, she felt a profound, numb disbelief. They had made it. The storm had passed over them, and they were still breathing. Elise reached into her apron pocket and touched a small, folded piece of paper. It was a letter she had written in her mind 100 times while sitting in the dark, a letter to her sister in a distant, quiet province. "We have come back to the sun," she thought, the words flowing like a quiet stream in her mind. "The city of our childhood is gone, swept away by a terrible wind. But the people, oh, the people are so incredibly beautiful. We have emerged from the earth covered in gray, but our hearts are still beating. We have lost our roofs, but we have found each other in the dust. Do not weep for the buildings, my sister. Weep for the joy that we are still here to see the morning." As the hours of the long summer day slowly passed, the initial shock of the ruins began to settle into a gentle, weary acceptance. The survivors of Caen did not wander aimlessly. They gravitated toward one another. The pale, dusty landscape became dotted with small gatherings of humanity. Neighbors who had been separated in the chaotic rush underground found each other again. There were sudden, gasping embraces. Faces buried in dusty shoulders. Hands gripping hands with a desperate, unbreakable strength. There were a chorus of survivors, bound together by the profound intimacy of having shared the exact same darkness. The social divides, the petty grievances of peacetime, were entirely erased by the falling ash. The wealthy merchant and the humble baker sat side by side on the broken stones, sharing a canteen of water, their faces identical masks of dust and exhaustion. When the afternoon began to wane, turning the sky into soft, liquid shades of peach and lavender, the flattened city took on a strange, melancholic beauty. The jagged edges of the ruins cast long, soft shadows across the gray earth. The breeze died down, and the world was bathed in a gentle, golden light. The people of Caen sat quietly among the remnants of their ancestral home. They watched the sun slowly descend toward the horizon. They were incredibly tired. They had no beds to sleep in, no hearths to light, and no doors to lock against the night. But as they sat together, wrapping their shawls around their shoulders and leaning against one another for warmth, there was a quiet, unbreakable resilience settling into their bones. The tears of grief for the broken stones had been shed, watering the dry, dusty earth. Now, the tears that fell in the twilight were the quiet, overwhelming tears of survival. They had faced the absolute edge of the world, they had hidden in the deepest shadows, and they had walked back out into the light. The city of Caen was not entirely gone, it had simply moved from the architecture of stone to the architecture of the human spirit. It lived on in the gentle touch of a stranger's hand, in the protective embrace of a mother, and in the quiet, stubborn heartbeat of a people who refused to be erased. As the stars began to pinprick the darkening sky, the survivors closed their eyes. They breathed in the cool evening air, entirely free from the scent of smoke. They rested upon the broken pieces of their past, wrapped in the profound, comforting solidarity of one another, ready to gently, slowly, begin the long journey toward tomorrow. When the heavy iron winds finally ceased, the loudest sound remaining was the gentle, breaking sound of a human heart. The great storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and echoing stillness over the valley. The sky, once bruised with the violent colors of fire and smoke, had softened into a vast, pale canopy of quiet gray. For the people of Caen, and for the weary young soldiers who now rested among them, the urgent, frantic need to simply survive had suddenly evaporated. In its place, a new and heavier atmosphere settled over the broken cobblestones. It was the time for looking back. It was the time for the slow, heartbreaking work of counting the empty spaces. As the morning mist drifted lazily off the slow-moving waters of the Orne River, the survivors began to walk through the unrecognizable landscape of their home. They did not walk with the hurried, desperate steps of the days before. They moved with a slow, sleepwalking grace, their eyes scanning the mountains of pale ash and shattered slate. They were searching. In the quiet ruins of a neighborhood that used to smell of blooming jasmine and warm bread, a young woman named Elise moved softly over the debris. Her dress was heavy with chalk dust, her hands scraped and tired. She was looking for her brother. They had been separated in the chaotic, blinding twilight when the sky first began to fall, their hands slipping apart in the terrified crowd. Elise did not shout his name. The silence of the city was too vast, too sacred to be broken by shouting. Instead, she let her eyes trace the outlines of the fallen timber and the pulverized limestone. Near the corner of what had once been a small, walled garden, she stopped. Poking out from beneath a heavy layer of gray dust was a small flash of deep, familiar crimson. Elise knelt down, her knees pressing into the sharp rubble. With trembling, careful fingers, she brushed the ash away. It was a knitted wool scarf. She knew every stitch of it, for she had made it herself during the long, cold evenings of the previous winter. She pulled it gently from the earth, shaking the dust from the soft wool. She held it in her hands, bringing it slowly to her face. It smelled of cold stone and rain, but beneath that, it carried the faint, lingering scent of his cologne. In that small, quiet moment, the fragile hope that had kept her walking for days finally snapped. Elise closed her eyes, burying her face in the crimson wool, and wept. Her tears fell completely silently, dropping like heavy, warm rain into the gray dust at her feet. They left tiny, dark craters in the ash. She did not wail. She simply let the sorrow wash over her, rocking gently back and forth in the ruins, cradling the scarf as if it were a sleeping child. This profound, quiet grief was unfolding all across the broken city and the sprawling, muddy fields beyond. It was a shared, silent language of mourning. Out in the open countryside, away from the shattered spires, the earth was soft and yielding from the summer rains. Here, among the crushed hedgerows and the bruised wildflowers, the young soldiers were performing their own tender, heartbreaking rituals. The brotherhood they had forged in the dark now asked them for one final, devastating act of devotion. A young infantryman named Arthur stood in a quiet corner of an apple orchard. The trees around him were stripped of their leaves, their branches splintered by the winds of the conflict, but the soil beneath them was deep and rich. Arthur was digging. He drove his small folding shovel into the dark, wet earth with a slow, rhythmic repetition. His movements were incredibly gentle, almost reverent, as if he were preparing a bed for a deeply loved friend to sleep in. And he was. Beside the shallow trench lay his closest companion, wrapped tightly in a canvas ground sheet. They had crossed the ocean together. They had shared their last cigarettes, whispered their deepest fears in the freezing mud, and promised to visit each other's homes when the world finally righted itself. Now, Arthur was completing the journey alone. When the earth was prepared, Arthur laid his friend to rest with an agonizing, infinite care. He smoothed the canvas. He sat on the damp grass for a long time, simply looking at the shape in the earth, the silence of the orchard pressing gently against his ears. He needed to leave a mark. He needed the world to know that the boy resting beneath the apple trees was loved, and that he had mattered. Arthur walked to a broken farmhouse nearby and found 2 pieces of shattered oak floorboard. Using a length of rough twine from his pack, he bound the 2 pieces of wood together, forming a simple, perfectly balanced cross. He carried it back to the orchard and pressed the base firmly into the soft earth at the head of the grave. Finally, he unclasped the heavy, dented tin helmet from his friend's belongings and rested it gently on the top of the wooden cross. It was a stark, beautifully simple monument. Arthur stood before it, taking off his own helmet and bowing his head. He did not know any grand prayers, so he simply spoke to his friend in the quiet, conversational tone they had always used. He told him that the sky was finally clearing. He promised to write to the boy's mother, to tell her that her son had been brave, and that he was resting in a beautiful, quiet place under the trees. Arthur reached out and placed his hand on the wooden cross for one last, lingering second. A gentle breeze moved through the orchard, rustling the few surviving apple blossoms, as if the earth itself were whispering a soft amen. The landscape of Normandy slowly became dotted with these tiny, sacred spaces. The simple wooden crosses rose from the mud, standing as quiet sentinels in the fading light. They were not monuments of victory, they were monuments of profound, unimaginable loss. Back in the city, the mourning took on a different, but equally tender, shape. The citizens who had lost everything found remarkable ways to honor those who had been taken by the storm. Near the great abbey of Saint Etienne, the courtyard had been transformed into a resting place. An older woman named Genevieve, who had spent the terrifying nights in the cellar humming lullabies to frighten children, now walked slowly among the makeshift graves in the courtyard. She carried a small woven basket filled with smooth, white river stones she had gathered from the banks of the Orne. She did not have flowers to give. The gardens of Caen had been swept away. But Genevieve knew that grief requires an action, a physical touch to anchor the heart. She stopped at the foot of a small wooden marker. She did not know the name written upon it in faded pencil. It did not matter. She reached into her basket, withdrew a single, perfectly smooth white stone, and placed it gently on the dark earth above the grave. It was a tiny, enduring gesture. The stone would not wither like a flower. It would sit there in the rain and the sun, a permanent, quiet testament that someone had stopped, someone had remembered, and someone had cared. Genevieve moved slowly through the courtyard, leaving her trail of white stones in the twilight, a grandmother to the entire broken city, offering her soft, silent grace to the sleeping strangers. As the days passed, the urge to communicate with the lost became an overwhelming ache. Without formal funerals or grand cemeteries, the people turned to the simplest, most intimate form of connection they knew. They wrote. In a quiet corner of a ruined library, sitting on a pile of fallen, dusty books, a father named Julian held a stub of a pencil and a torn piece of ledger paper. He was writing to his young daughter, whose laughter had been silenced in the first days of the falling sky. He wrote to her with a beautiful, poetic desperation. He told her about the little stray cat that had survived the rubble and was now sleeping in his coat pocket. He told her that the stars seemed brighter now that the smoke had cleared. He wrote, "My sweet girl, I look for you in every shadow and listen for you in every quiet breeze. The city is empty without you, but my heart is so entirely full of the love you left behind. I will carry you with me, in my chest, until my own walking is done." Julian folded the letter into a tiny, perfect square. He walked out into the evening light, finding a patch of soft earth near the remains of their home. He dug a small hole with his bare hands, placed the folded letter inside, and covered it gently with the dirt. He was mailing his love directly into the earth, trusting that the quiet roots and the deep soil would carry his words to her sleeping soul. These unseen letters, buried in the rubble and tucked beneath the wooden crosses, were the true history of the aftermath. They were paper vessels filled with an ocean of longing, keeping the memory of the departed fiercely alive in a world that had tried to erase them. When the evening finally began to fall over Caen, turning the pale dust into soft shades of charcoal and indigo, a beautiful, spontaneous ritual emerged from the sorrow. As the twilight deepened, the survivors did not retreat into the dark. Instead, they struck matches. One by one, tiny, flickering golden flames began to bloom across the ruined city. There were small rationing candles, salvaged lanterns, and sometimes just pieces of twisted cloth dipped in oil. The people set them upon the broken walls, on the stone steps of the abbey, and at the bases of the wooden crosses. The city, which had recently burned with the terrifying, roaring fire of destruction, now glowed with a million tiny, fragile points of light. It was a vigil of breathtaking scale. Families sat together in the gentle illumination, holding hands, their faces painted in the warm amber glow. Soldiers sat in the fields, watching the candles flicker in the distance like a fallen galaxy. In this shared, luminous quiet, they were no longer just individuals carrying an unbearable weight. They were a single, breathing collective of survival and memory. The light pushed back the suffocating dark. It was a gentle rebellion against the finality of loss. The tears that fell in the dust that night were illuminated by the candles, glittering like tiny diamonds in the ash. They mourned the boys who would never grow old, the mothers who would never see their gardens bloom again, and the beautiful, ordinary lives that had been interrupted by the storm. But as they sat together in the glowing ruins, feeling the warmth of their neighbors' shoulders and the steady beat of their own hearts, the sharp, jagged edges of the grief began to slowly, ever so slowly, soften. The earth held their fallen gently. The pale dust absorbed their tears, binding their sorrow into the very foundations of the city. The night breeze swept through the Orne Valley, causing the candle flames to dance and bow, but they did not go out. The people of Caen, and the young men who had fought for them, rested in the quiet, sacred glow. They honored their loss not with shouts or stone monuments, but with the profound, everyday heroism of simply remembering. They held the memories close, wrapped in the quiet resilience of the human spirit, keeping the love alive in the gentle, watchful dark, waiting patiently for the healing touch of the dawn. Even the deepest wounds of the earth eventually surrendered to the gentle, stubborn insistence of a single green leaf. When the great, heavy curtain of the storm finally lifted from the valley of the Orne, the sky did not immediately blaze with a triumphant light. Instead, the morning arrived with a soft, forgiving grace. The thick, churning clouds of bruised violet and charcoal gray slowly thinned, pulling apart like spun sugar to reveal a vast, breathtaking canopy of the palest, most peaceful blue. The sun crested the horizon not with a fiery glare, but with a warm, liquid gold that poured gently over the shattered slate and the pale, powdered limestone of Caen. In this new, quiet light, the city lay perfectly still, exhaling a long, trembling breath it had held for weeks. The air was entirely changed. The sharp, metallic tang of the conflict and the heavy, suffocating smell of burning timber had been washed away by the night rains. Now, the breeze drifting in from the English Channel carried only the clean, crisp scent of the sea, completely entwined with the deep, rich, organic perfume of damp earth. Nature, in her infinite and beautiful wisdom, holds no memories of the borders drawn by men. She does not mourn the fallen architecture of empires, she simply begins the quiet, relentless work of healing the ground. Out in the cratered fields and the crushed hedgerows surrounding the city, this healing began before the last of the dust had even settled. Where the heavy iron machines had churned the ancient soil into a sea of gray mud, tiny, miraculous things were happening. A single drop of morning dew gathered on the tip of a bruised blade of grass, catching the sunlight and glowing like a fragile diamond. Deep within the muddy tracks left by the heavy canvas boots, a buried seed, warmed by the rising sun, began to quietly stretch its roots into the dark, wet earth. Inside the ruined city, the people of Caen emerged from their cellars and sanctuaries not to flee, but to stay. The initial, breathless shock of seeing their ancestral home flattened to the ground had passed, softening into a deep, familiar sorrow. But humans, much like the earth they walk upon, are beautifully stubborn creatures. When their world is broken, they do not simply stare at the pieces, they kneel in the dust and begin to gather them up. In the remains of a small, walled courtyard near the center of the city, an older woman named Elodie stood among the fallen bricks of her home. Her heavy woolen skirt was stained with the gray ash of the underground, and her hands were rough and tired. She was not looking for lost silver or broken china. She was looking at the ground. There, pushing its way through a narrow, jagged crack between two shattered cobblestones, was a tiny, brilliant speck of emerald green. It was a single shoot of wild ivy, no taller than a thimble, uncurling its delicate new leaves toward the sun. Elodie slowly knelt beside it, her joints popping softly in the quiet morning air. She did not touch it, afraid that even the weight of her gentle finger might break its fragile stem. She simply hovered her hands around it, creating a small, warm shadow to protect it from the breeze. In that tiny, impossible stroke of green against the endless sea of gray ash, Elodie saw the entire future of her city. The storm had broken their walls, it had shattered their windows, and it had brought the very sky crashing down upon their heads. But it had not killed the roots. The roots of the city, much like the roots of the ivy, were buried deep, safe in the dark, waiting for the light to return. Elodie smiled, a soft, trembling curve of her lips that felt like a forgotten language. She found a chipped porcelain teacup in the rubble, walked to a small puddle of clear rainwater, and carried a few precious drops back to the tiny plant. She watered the green shoot with the infinite care of a mother tending to a newborn, her heart swelling with a quiet, unbreakable promise that they, too, would grow again. All across the ruined avenues, the soundtrack of the city began to change. The deafening thunder of the weeks before was replaced by a gentle, rhythmic symphony of everyday resilience. It was a beautiful, deeply human music. It was the soft, sweeping sound of a straw broom pushing the pale plaster dust off a surviving stone step. Shoo, shhh, shhh. It was a meditative, calming rhythm, a woman reclaiming her tiny square of the world, making it clean, making it home again. It was the quiet clatter of salvaged bricks being stacked together in an open alleyway to form a makeshift oven. Neighbors, who only days ago had huddled together in the terrifying dark of the quarries, now stood shoulder to shoulder in the sunlight. They combined their last handfuls of rationed flour, sharing the precious water from their canteens to knead a single, communal loaf of bread. When that bread finally baked, the warm, yeasty aroma that drifted over the ruins was the most intoxicating, magnificent smell in the world. It tasted faintly of wood smoke and ash, but to the people who shared it, breaking the warm crust with their dusty hands, it tasted entirely of survival. It tasted of love. The young soldiers who had brought the storm and weathered it alongside the citizens were now preparing to leave. Their long, grueling journey was pulling them away from the valley, toward the distant horizon. But as they packed their heavy canvas bags and slung their rifles over their shoulders, they did not move with the sharp, aggressive energy of combat. They moved with a slow, gentle reverence. A young infantryman named Julian stood at the edge of the city, looking back at the broken spires of the abbeys. His uniform was tattered, his face worn, but his eyes were incredibly clear. He unbuttoned his breast pocket and pulled out his small, battered notebook. He did not write of the fear anymore. He wrote a final letter to his mother, his pencil gliding softly over the paper. "We are leaving the city today," Julian wrote, the morning breeze ruffling the edges of the page. "The air behind us is finally still. I am looking at the ruins, and my heart aches for the people here, but I also feel a profound, sweeping peace. I saw a man this morning carefully polishing a surviving window pane until it shone in the sun. I saw a grandmother giving a soldier her last sip of tea. The world can be so terrible, Mother, but the people in it are so incredibly beautiful. We are walking toward the horizon now, but I am leaving a piece of my heart in these quiet, dusty streets. I am coming home to you, and I am bringing the silence with me." He folded the letter, a permanent record of his quiet hope, and tucked it safely against his chest. As the long columns of weary boys began to walk slowly out of the valley, their heavy boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the dirt roads, the citizens of Caen stood by the ruins and watched them go. There was no grand parade, only gentle nods of the head, a raised hand in silent farewell, and the profound, shared understanding of a sorrow that was finally ending. As the days turned into weeks, the true green shoots of tomorrow began to emerge in the most beautiful, unexpected ways. The children of Caen, who had learned to be so impossibly quiet in the dark cellars, slowly remembered how to be children again. In a wide expanse of flattened rubble that had once been a busy market square, a group of small boys and girls gathered. They had found a few pieces of pale blue chalk in the debris. With absolute, serious concentration, they began to draw on the large, flat slabs of fallen limestone. They drew the outlines of doors, of tall windows with flower boxes, of chimneys with curly, white smoke. They were drawing their city back into existence. And then, one of the little girls, chasing a white butterfly that had drifted into the square, let out a sudden, bright laugh. It was a high, sweet, trilling sound, entirely free of fear. It echoed off the broken stones, ringing out like a tiny, perfect silver bell. For the adults working in the ruins nearby, that sound stopped them entirely in their tracks. A man lifting a heavy timber beam gently set it back down. A woman sweeping the ash paused, resting her chin on the handle of her broom. They closed their eyes and just listened to the laughter. It was the ultimate defiance. It was the purest, most concentrated form of healing. The children were reclaiming the space, washing away the shadows with their joy, proving that the human capacity for happiness is far stronger than the world's capacity for destruction. Down in the valley, the River Orne continued its slow, murmuring journey. The heavy, gray ash that had choked its waters was slowly being carried out to the vast, open sea. The water began to run clear again, catching the blue of the sky and the golden light of the sun. The river had seen the city rise, it had seen it fall, and it would patiently watch it rise again. It was a beautiful, flowing ribbon of time, smoothing the sharp, painful edges of the memory, washing the land clean. The rebuilding of Caen would not happen in a day, or a month, or even a year. It would be a slow, painstaking labor of love. But the foundation had already been laid, not with stone or mortar, but with the quiet, everyday heroism of the people. It was built upon the shared loaves of bread, the watered ivy, the laughter of the children, and the millions of unsent letters carrying the unbreakable promise of a peaceful tomorrow. As the sun began to set on this new, quiet world, it painted the sky in the softest, most forgiving shades of lavender, peach, and deep indigo. The evening mist rolled gently off the river, wrapping the broken city in a cool, comforting embrace. The people of Caen returned to their makeshift shelters, to their cleared cellars and their patched-together roofs. They lit their small candles, but this time, the light did not flicker with the trembling of the earth. The flame stood tall and perfectly still, casting a warm, steady, golden glow. They lay down to rest. The night was vast, and deeply, beautifully silent. The stars emerged one by one, a brilliant, watchful canopy over the sleeping valley. The heavy burdens of the past had finally been set down. The storm was truly over. And there, in the soft, forgiving earth, beneath the quiet, starlit sky, the green shoots of tomorrow were already stretching upward, growing stronger in the dark, reaching ever so gently, and ever so bravely, for the light of the new dawn.